Welcome to the third of a three-part series of Legacy of Eugenics in New England. On this, the third of the three groups, we're going to be talking about eugenics into the future. My name is Professor Nora Gross from University College London, and a few housekeeping issues before we start. First, we'd like to thank the Hutchins Center. We'd like to thank our participants for today, and we'd like to thank the audience for joining us over the past two sessions and for this session in what I feel has been a really interesting and productive series of discussions. I'd also like to give thanks to Benedict Ipgrave, who's very modest, but without whom none of this would have been possible. He's really brought the whole project together. This is part of the From Small Beginnings project, and the website for that, www.fromsmallbeginnings.org, is something I would strongly encourage our viewers to get online. This isn't the only series of conferences, meetings, discussion groups, and other projects around the From Small Beginnings effort, and so please check out all the other really interesting things that are going around this project that I think speak to what's current and future concerns about eugenics. The previous sessions will be on that website, and today's session will also be uploaded, and it will also be on the Hutchins Center site as well. Today's session is oriented around looking ahead, how we confront and disrupt the trajectories of eugenics moving forward. As such, as well as hearing from our panelists and chairs today, we're keen to hear from the audience. If there are any questions or key thoughts that audience members would like to share, if they would be kind enough to drop them into the chat in the concluding session, hopefully our panelists will be able to discuss some of the issues raised. For those whose comments we won't be able to get to, we would still encourage people to send as many comments as they can, and we'll strive to include these in discussions moving into the future. Likewise, we'd also be keen to invite our audience members to suggest and participate in next steps. So if they'd like to be part of plans moving forward, please be in touch with us via this From Small Beginnings site. Sorry. The emphasis today is, well, before we start, what we will do is I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. We've been doing this in all the sessions, and Benedict has asked me to do this on behalf of me and of the greater all of us who work in New England. I think as someone who's worked in all the New England states and lived in all the New England states except New Hampshire, I would personally like to thank the following tribal groups from my work in Cambridge and Boston: the Pawtucket, in Burlington, Vermont, the Abnaki and Wabanaki, from Martha's Vineyard, where I've done a good deal of work over the years, the Wampanoags, and from New Haven, Connecticut, where I was a faculty member at Yale for quite a while, the Quinnipiac, and the Paugussett and Wapanger groups, and from Maine, the Wabanaki and the Abnaki tribal groups. As with all people who work and live in New England, it is to these tribal groups that we owe both the land and the the land and the rights to work and live in such a beautiful part of the world. I'd like to start with my first handover. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Neil Baer, Dr. Neil Baer from the Harvard Medical School. Neil is an award-winning showrunner, television writer and producer, physician, author, and a public health advocate and expert. Today he will be giving a presentation entitled CRISPR, What Lies in Store, and we'll give Neil 10 minutes, and the floor, Neil, is yours.
I'm Neil Baer. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And recently, I edited a compendium of essays on CRISPR and the future that was published in Perspectives in Biology and Medicine from Johns Hopkins University. And those essays, along with several additional ones, will be coming out in 2022 in a book called Reshaping Human Nature, The Promise and Peril of CRISPR. So I'm delighted to be here today to talk about issues that haven't really been discussed fully societally on the future of CRISPR and its uses. So I'm going to begin by talking about Harvard Medical School, where I was fortunate to attend. When I was there, I graduated in 1996. We had 4 societies and a 5th with the program in HST, which is with MIT. And the societies divided us into equal groups so that we had a chance to really get to know each other and have tutorials with one another. One of those societies was called the Oliver Wendell Holmes Society. And in 2020, HMS decided to change the name of the Oliver Wendell Holmes Society to the William Augustus Hinton Society after students raised objections to naming one of the 5 societies after a leading medical researcher and former dean of HMS who espoused racist ideals, including the expulsion of 3 Black students under pressure from other students in the community. And also his work in promoting eugenics and the famous Supreme Court ruling where he, along with 7 other justices, ruled that it was permissible to perform on people, eugenic ways so that they couldn't reproduce. So a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Medical School, William Augustus Hinton, was internationally recognized as an infectious disease researcher. He was an HMS faculty member and the first Black full professor at Harvard. So Dean George Daly from Harvard Medical School said that as HMS works to foster a culture of diversity and inclusion and contribute to a more just and equitable world, it is vitally important that our campus environment reflect our values, inspire our community, and demonstrate that all we aspire to can be attained. So the task force that was composed of students and faculty at Harvard Medical School found that although Holmes's contribution to science and medicine continue to be seen as significant, quote, his publicly articulated views concerning racial inequality, even understood in the context of their time, and perhaps further informing our understanding of his role in the expulsion of HMS's first 3 African-American students, run especially contrary to the school's guiding principles. So in terms of eugenics, one of the principal espousers of eugenics was Oliver Wendell Holmes. This was an attempt by Harvard Medical School to rectify what the students saw as a certain injustice. And so where are we now with eugenics in the sense of CRISPR? The National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine in 2015 launched an initiative to discuss the future of CRISPR and its uses related to the recent advances in human genome editing research. And they initiated 2 international summits, one in 2015, one in 2018. Of course, we all know about the one in 2018 when Dr. He's experiment on the twin embryos resulted in tremendous controversy when he used CRISPR to change the genes of those embryos by editing them, and we call that germline genome editing. And they released a consensus study in 2017 and then another report in 2020. And they're going to have a meeting in the United Kingdom in March of 2022 this year. In 2015, they wrote about the importance of societal consensus, how that can be achieved wasn't really gone into. But the sense is that we needed to have scientists, of course, but also people in the arts and humanities, in bioethics, in religious affiliations, also citizens, to talk about what the future of CRISPR should be. What's changed and what's really fascinating is that that line has really turned into one of, well, somebody has edited embryos, Dr. Hu, and there may be unusual cases where we might want to do germline editing. And let's be clear about germline editing versus somatic editing. So we're using CRISPR, and it is truly incredible to treat, for instance, sickle cell disease. And it's reported that a woman has been cured by using CRISPR. Also with people with beta thalassemia, some rare eye diseases, a rare liver disease that makes a protein that causes severe neuropathy and death. These have all been treated by CRISPR. These are somatic. So in other words, the people who've been treated will not pass this on to their progeny because they're having the CRISPR work done where it homes in on their genes, not on their gametes or their sex cell genes. In the case of Dr. Hu, he used CRISPR on embryos. So conceivably that would change the future of those children's children or their progeny, and they would all have the new CRISPR genes. So we make the distinction between somatic CRISPR editing and germline genome editing. So what lies in store for us with CRISPR? These are topics that are going to be covered in our book, Reshaping Human Nature. So first, CRISPR and the dilemma of being human. So we need to talk about, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to change people's genomes with CRISPR? People are very worried about changing intelligence or giving people a leg up and who's going to be able to afford it and who's not. Our genes are not really, there's not one gene for intelligence, but there is one gene that causes sickle cell disease or cystic fibrosis. So we could conceivably get rid of those diseases by using CRISPR and doing it on embryos as well, if we decided to do that. And some people have argued, George Church at Harvard, that might be ultimately less expensive in the future. So the issue comes up, though, about changing human evolution. We have the tools, conceivably, to change human evolution with CRISPR if we do germline editing. And to what extent do we want to do that? And is it ever acceptable? There are cases, for instance, of couples who want to have a biological child and they have very rare diseases and they both carry the genes, for instance, for deafness, and they want to have a child who is able to hear. Well, the only way they could have a child who would be hearing and not deaf would be through CRISPR. Because pre-implantation genetic diagnosis would be of no use. And we use that to screen out Marfan's disease or sickle cell disease or cystic fibrosis. It's expensive. It has medical costs for the woman who is needing to go through IVF to do this. But it is a way of ensuring that an embryo doesn't have a certain mutation and then it's implanted. But in these very rare cases, it's conceivable that CRISPR might be the only way to go through this. And so there's some now question and some openness on the part of, say, the national academies to allow this to happen. So that would be the first time that we would allow germline genome editing as opposed to treating diseases with somatic cell editing. So these all bring up questions for us of what is the nature of being human in terms of evolution and speeding up possibly evolution. What does it mean that the roll of the dice in being, and what we get from our parents. There's a lot of debate, for instance, about sports and trans people, but one thing that's not really talked about is that, if I wanted to be a Michael Phelps swimmer, it's never going to happen. The genetic roll of the dice didn't come my way in terms of giving me a body of a swimmer and that kind of build and that kind of height. So we don't talk about fairness often in that way, but athletics is not fair at all in terms of one may aspire to be a basketball player, but maybe 5'4", and it's just probably never going to happen. And so we have the ability potentially in the future to change a number of things, particularly in polymorphic areas where there are numbers of genes that contribute. As we learn more and more, what does it mean to be human if we can affect these different things and manipulate them? And what does it mean, for those who could afford it and those who can't? It's going to be interesting with sickle cell disease because there's a lot of investment in these companies right now by venture capital to make these CRISPR-oriented treatments, and they are working. But there are 100,000 African Americans in the United States with sickle cell disease. Will they be able to get this treatment that will likely be expensive? Another topic that we might want to discuss is the prospects for eradicating human disease. Here again, as I was saying, it's already possible, particularly with blood diseases, because it's much easier to introduce the CRISPR technology into the blood system as opposed to having cystic fibrosis or muscular dystrophy, but they're working, scientists and researchers are working on really interesting ways to deliver the CRISPR-Cas system to make this possible. So we're going to see the possibility of eradicating really terrible diseases, and that is really a wonderful aspect of CRISPR. The other side of it, of course, is the new eugenics. Do we want to not have children with Down syndrome? Do we want to get rid of people who have, do we want to use CRISPR to not have deaf people? There's a lot of discussion about deafness being part of human variability, human variation, or neurovariability and variation with autism and autism spectrum. So where is that cutoff between something like cystic fibrosis and people with disabilities who lead fulfilling lives? And we have a wonderful essay by Ethan Weiss from UCSF in our book, whose daughter has albinism, and the question of would he and his wife have used CRISPR if they knew that their child would be born with albinism. So these questions of the new eugenics, or as Rosemarie Garland Thompson calls it, velvet eugenics. We know, for instance, just in prenatal testing in Denmark, for instance, there's a wonderful piece in The Atlantic not too long ago about eliminating Down syndrome in that country through prenatal testing. Is that something we want to do? That's something that we need to have a conversation about, I believe. And then, of course, there's this other side of things, which is biosecurity implications of gene editing. So we can use CRISPR, for instance, gene drives that was developed by Kevin Esvelt at MIT, and conceivably could use it to eradicate mosquitoes. There's an experiment being done in Key West right now to do that. But what are the unintended consequences, and have we focused enough on them to be thinking about that? Do we really know what mosquitoes' places in the ecosystem is, or should we just go about doing it because, of course, malaria causes such terrible, terrible illness and death amongst people around the world? And then on the other side, that's the health side. Should we allow people, researchers, anyone, for instance, to get DNA sequences to build, say, for instance, smallpox or horsepox, which was done in Canada, or polio, or various other combinations of viruses? It's something that we need to consider, the biosecurity, and that leads us to a topic of controls, oversight, and monitoring. There really, across the world, aren't controls. We're not supposed to do germline editing. It's forbidden, and Dr. He went to prison. But what are the laws around the world? And what are the laws in terms of oversight of being able to purchase DNA sequences, and what should we demand from the companies that sell them? And there's a lot of discussion about how to monitor, how to make sure that when some lab is ordering something that looks like it could be a part of, say, smallpox or Ebola, what do we do to make sure that that doesn't happen? And so we need to start talking about oversight, which of course rankles some scientists who want to have the freedom to do their work. Where do we balance that freedom with protecting the society and making sure that something terrible doesn't happen? And then CRISPR in a post-COVID-19 world. So CRISPR is being used in all kinds of ways to make tests, and we're learning more and more. And Jennifer Doudna's company has done that in testing for COVID. So we know now that we live in a post-COVID world where there are likely to be new viruses that come, and possibly more pandemics. How can CRISPR be used to fight and address that? And the good side of CRISPR, of course, so, and the promising side. So we need to think about both the promise and the peril, and those discussions need to be, I believe, widespread. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to having these conversations.
Thank you, Neil. That was a really interesting discussion and a perfect start to the entire session today. Our second speaker is Theresa Blankmeyer-Burke. Theresa is a philosophy professor and bioethicist at Gallaudet University. She's the first deaf woman to receive a PhD in philosophy in the world. She works in a field she defines as deaf philosophy, the space where philosophy intersects with deaf studies. She's currently serving as the faculty administrator for the faculty development, in the office of the provost at Gallaudet. She's also editor of the Journal of Philosophy of Disability, along with Joel Michael Reynolds. And I should add, I'm a great fan of her work. Today, she will be talking on gene editing with CRISPR and prime editing and the deaf community. And without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Theresa.
Hello, everyone. I will start today in American Sign Language. I'm happy to be here at Gallaudet and joining you all virtually. And so I'm very excited and looking forward to these discussions today. I want to start my talk in ASL, and then I will transition to English. And the reason I've decided to do that is because I am a proud signing member of the deaf community, and I also have voice privilege, which means that I'm able to switch between these two languages. And in many ways, my experiences are enriched by my ability to both sign in the deaf community, as well as my ability to assimilate sort of with the larger hearing community.
Okay, so
All
I'm
right.
now going to do a sound check. I almost said sign check, but that's obviously not the right thing to say. I hope that you can all hear me. If someone could just type something in the chat, okay, that's great. I want to start by sharing my screen. Okay. And so I've titled this talk, which is really an overview, Gene Editing with CRISPR, Prime Editing, and the Deaf Community. And I will start off with a couple comments about my personal connections with eugenics. And from there, I will then move on to some of the history of bioethics and gene editing, which Dr. Bayer has already mentioned in brief. So I will hopefully touch on some parts that he hasn't touched to avoid repetition. And then I will move to this question of what are flourishing deaf lives, and talk about the near and more distant future when it comes to gene editing, both somatic and germline human gene editing. But I want to begin with a nod to my former and late father-in-law, who was the first Black man to graduate from Caltech. Grant Gilbert Venerable has recently been honored by having a dormitory at Caltech, which was called the Ruddock House, named for the eugenicist and Caltech trustee who promoted a fund for researching eugenics and biological distinctions of race at Caltech. His name was removed from the dormitory, Ruddock House. It is now called Venerable House. And I wanted to acknowledge the importance of making these connections between race and ethnicity and eugenics, as well as disability, because all too often disability is, or disability and deaf studies are constructed in ways that leave out those of us who are people of color. I also wanted to mention two other connections. So my grandfather, my paternal grandfather's brother, Martin Blankmeyer, who lived in California, was forcibly removed from his family home, his only home, when he was in his 40s because he had Down syndrome, and the state felt that it was better that rather than live with his mother and his sister and other members of his family, he should be placed in institutional living. I only found out about this very recently, and part of the reason I found out about it was because my family was having Zoom conversations during COVID, during the lockdown, and because of captioning, I was able to better participate. And let me add one other note. So last night, as I was working on these remarks, I received an email from a biotech venture capital company asking for my consultation with their gene editing projects, which were focused on eliminating monogenetic deafness. So this is the context that we're living in right now. I have a particular position and assumptions. My first assumption is that deaf and disabled people's lives are valued. My second assumption is that deaf and disabled people are diverse. There is not one way of being deaf or disabled in the world. I also think that the bioethics conversation about deaf people connected to CRISPR and other gene editing technologies could benefit from more deaf voices, whether they're voices in sign or voices in spoken language. And I want to acknowledge these are really hard discussions. The language is tricky, the politics are sticky, and we need to work together to create respectful spaces for listening, learning, and discussion. So let's turn now to a little bit of the history of bioethics. In the US, you have the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, created during President Ford's administration. This was the first national public body to shape bioethics policy in the US, and it issued the Belmont Report, which most of you are probably familiar with. This document still shapes and influences bioethics today in clinical and research settings, although I will say in academic bioethics, there is definitely a lot of discussion about other ways to approach bioethics rather than just using the 4 principles in the Belmont Report. Now, our last presidential administration did not have a bioethics commission. And that was the first time since the 1970s that we didn't have this. And the result of that was kind of an interesting one, because it meant that different agencies and organizations felt a strong need to put together their own projects. And in particular, I would like to refer you to the disability and bioethics reports that were written by Dredith and funded by the National Council on Disability. And disclosure, I was part of the team of authors that put that together. But this was a way of looking at how disability and bioethics come together. And there is a particular report that focuses on gene editing, and I strongly recommend you take a look at that. We're now here in Washington, kind of looking to see, will President Biden establish a bioethics commission? And COVID-19, climate change, bioethics are very much being discussed right now. And my question is, where does gene editing technology fit? And I thank Dr. Bayer for his remarks about how in this time of climate change, there is concern about an increased rate of pandemics, how gene technology, gene editing technology fits into this. And I look forward to having more discussion about that, hopefully this afternoon. I wanted to give you a sense of the landscape of our genetic technology policy. So as Dr. Bayer mentioned, we've had these international summits in 2015, where the first set of guidelines was issued, or recommendations that said, let's not go ahead and do gene editing of human embryos because the technology is not ready. And also we need to have these conversations about whether we ought to do it. In 2018, there was the big announcement by Dr. He about the gene editing on these embryos. We look forward to seeing what happens in March 2022. I hope to be there, maybe presenting, I'm not sure yet. But then we also have had a series of other reports. So we've had the 2017 report by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which gives a big overview about science, ethics, and governance, and how to approach this issue of whether we should, this question of whether we should go forward or not with human gene editing. And we're going forward. But at that point in time, there was still this question of under what circumstances is it ethically justified and when is it not? In 2018, the Nuffield Council, which is a bioethics organization in the UK, issued a report. Another disclosure, I helped participate in the writing of that report, in which they urged serious caution in going forward. And there are special commentaries related to the signing deaf community and other disability communities that are identity communities, and the importance of considering our input as this discussion continues. In 2020, there was the Heritable Human Genome Editing Report and the International Commission on the Clinical Use of Human Germline Genome Editing issued this report. Two key points that I want to make about that. One is that it used the language of serious conditions. Now, serious conditions for this report was a, was a dividing line between what are the conditions for which we say, yes, this should be something where we can apply human genome editing, and those that are not serious do not fall into that basket. Now, in this report, there is a footnote, and it was also discussed during the press release that announced this, that deafness is not such a serious condition. And I think that's important to know. It's a little win for the signing deaf community, if you will. Also in 2020, you have the United Nations Human Rights Report on Disability and Bioethics, and a segment of that is devoted to human genome editing. Like, another disclosure on my part. I apologize, it sounds very arrogant, but this is what I do. I'm involved in various kinds of discussions around the signing deaf community. And then recently, this past summer, the WHO Advisory Committee release their human gene editing recommendations. So that's the landscape. This is a very hot topic. It slowed down some during the pandemic, and now it's roaring back up. And how does this fit with the signing deaf community? Many of you may already know that over 90% of all deaf children have hearing parents. And I use deaf in the lowercase to indicate that these children may not be members of the signing deaf community. The transmission of deaf culture typically occurs in state residential schools for the deaf. And there's a critical mass of sign language users that is needed to sustain cultural and linguistic knowledge. And I want to also just make a side note. So these state residential schools for the deaf historically, especially in the US American South, were segregated. At Gallaudet, we have a brand new center on Black deaf studies, which is looking at what the historical record is and the language transmission of Black ASL in these segregated schools. So I want to also mention that typically deaf children who were born to hearing parents in the past were placed in these residential schools where they became enculturated to the signing deaf community. Now, the incidence of deafness in childhood is decreasing for a lot of different reasons. Immunizations for things like rubella, cochlear implant surgery, genetic screening, and all of this is contributing to the closure of residential state schools for the deaf. Many members of the signing deaf cultural community worry that we may become endangered and could possibly become extinct in the future, hastened by technologies like CRISPR and prime editing. This is an existential threat for us, and it's part of the reason why we are so committed at Gallaudet to having conversations and to asking that we be included in these conversations. So what are some of the ethical issues? Dr. Baer referenced some of them, and I'm going to just go through a set of these so that you can start thinking over some of these questions. So the first one is parents don't make choices about their children in a vacuum. Parents have a conception of what a good life is, and almost all of their choices about their child or potential child reflect this conception. In a liberal democracy, we give parents considerable latitude. So one question is, ought we to restrict parental choices regarding their child or their potential child's genes? And I think you can all see some of the challenges in even considering this question. Another set of questions are around the issue of autonomy. So parents have had their autonomy supported when it comes to child rearing decisions, including, sorry about the typo, medical and educational decisions. And my question is this now ethically defensible if it means the potential elimination or serious diminishment of a cultural community that is to a large extent predicated on a biological difference? And this is where the echoes of the past eugenics come in. So, should the deaf community be protected from this potential threat of eradication? And if so, what arguments do we offer? One argument or set of arguments is about the goodness of biological diversity. Biological diversity is good instrumentally because it's good for certain things. And in the case of the signing deaf community, some of the arguments that have been advanced in the context of deaf gain is how deaf people use space adds to this pot of human knowledge, how sign languages emerge, add to the linguistic narrative about how languages emerge and are formed, human language writ large, not just sign languages, but spoken languages. But I would like to say that that is not a sufficient argument. I think what we need to focus on is the intrinsic value of assigning deaf community. This is a community that is good in itself. Another way of looking at this is to say, well, modality is important in linguistic diversity. We have spoken language, we have signed language, and those people who study different languages, who look at arts and culture and how these emerge in sign language, spoken language, think that modality is an important component of these human endeavors. And the last thing I'd like to add is group rights. Philosophically, rights have traditionally been grounded in the individual. There are scholars who advocate for group rights. So that's another way of looking at how one might make the argument that deaf people ought to be protected from this threat of eradication by CRISPR and prime editing. Another topic is the question of harm and bodily integrity. So harm is something that we can have disagreement about. What counts as harm? Is it harm to be in a body like mine? And who has the ultimate say over whether I am harmed by being deaf or not? There is also a chain of argument connected to bodily integrity. And most of this in the literature is related to circumcision and other genital modification, but it can also be body modifications such as piercing or scarification or other ways of changing the body. And the argument here is that humans do have some kind of integrity in their body when they are born, and aside from life-threatening interventions, this integrity ought to be respected. So I asked, and this is a citation to my link to my dissertation written 10 years ago, whether there's a parallel claim for genomic integrity. Just as we're assigning bodily integrity to children, ought we to be also assigning genomic integrity? So such an integrity might include a right to be born deaf, a right to be born as a little person, or to be born gay, or to be born autistic, and that the last two is on the condition that a genetic basis can be definitively established. I'll continue with my questions, since that's what we philosophers do. So there's a question of economics. And sometimes if you are in a society that has been retrofitted to accommodate people with disabilities or people who are different in some way, this becomes expensive for the society. We cannot really tear everything down and build anew. So now our question around this aspect of, we have a society, a built environment that has structures that discriminate against particular groups of people and individuals. So where does the burden to include come from? Do potential parents have a duty or obligation to bear children who are less costly? Do people with disabilities have similar obligations to alter our bodies if possible? Is society ethically obligated to change to become universally accessible rather than accommodationist? I'm just about ready to wind up here, and I wanted to make the suggestion that what we ought to consider is this idea of a different center. The photograph on the slide shows Gallaudet during the Deaf President Now protests. And this protest is one of the events that eventually led to the American with Disabilities Act. And it was about a community of individuals at an academic institution saying, why can we not have someone like us leading us? Why not have a deaf president? So the different center idea comes from the writings of Carol Patton and Tom Humphreys, who offer that the way we look at hard of hearing status differs whether you are starting from a deaf center or from a hearing center. And I would like to suggest that the way we look at CRISPR and Prime and other human gene editing technologies differs whether we are starting from a center of scientific and medical knowledge or whether we are starting from a center of being human in a number of diverse ways. Finally, I wanted to provide this link to you. The Gallaudet University Bioethics in the Deaf Community class developed a website as a teaching tool for bioethics courses. And this website is all about a pretend case study in which parents want to use genetic technology in order to have a hearing or deaf child. And it is accessible in spoken English, in written English with captions, and in American Sign Language. I recommend it to you if you are teaching. I think it's a fantastic resource. And I'm so proud of my students for acting to make change in this very challenging time. Thank you. And I look forward to joining you again later this afternoon.
Theresa, thank you. Very, very interesting questions, and hopefully we'll get back. And as we discuss this over the course of the coming few hours, these issues will come up, I'm sure, again. I'm now pleased to hand over the floor to Natalie Koffler. Natalie is a trained molecular biologist who now works at the intersection of science and society. Her work is fueled by a desire to transform scientific culture and make science more representative of the community it's meant to serve. Towards this goal, she focuses on improving scientific training and curriculum, cultivating public dialogue and engagement, and creating more just and rigorous decision-making processes to steer responsible development of emerging technologies. Today, Natalie will be chairing the coming panel on the future of gene editing and genomics. Natalie, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nora, for that really kind introduction, and thank you both to Neil and Theresa for really getting us started on a great in a great way of really having a lot of questions popping around in our minds, I'm sure. I am absolutely so excited to be joined today with three panelists who are absolute inspirations for me. As Nora mentioned, I am a molecular biologist by training, and it was really the really challenging ethical and social questions that CRISPR gene editing arose in me to kind of leave the lab and really think about the kinds of spaces and conversations that we need to be making to create decisions that really, serve everyone and steer this technology in a way, and towards a future where everyone can thrive and flourish. And as Theresa mentioned, these are super tricky, uncomfortable conversations. These ideas about CRISPR, gene editing, and humanity and what it means to be human, they're emotional, they're political, they're highly, highly value laden. And what's become really clear is we don't really have spaces within our laboratories, within our academic institutions, within our governments, within our own towns and communities to have these conversations and have a conversation where, we really hear the voices of the people that we need to hear from. Theresa, for example, mentioned the recent report from the WHO on human germline gene editing. There wasn't a single person on that panel that identifies as having a physical disability. So we need to be doing a lot better. And so I just want to introduce three people who are thinking about how to do better and creating spaces and ways of thinking about CRISPR in very different ways and steering technology in a way that is just, that is safe and is informed by multiple and diverse experiences and perspectives. I will first introduce our three panelists, and then they will take about 3 to 5 minutes to not only maybe respond to some of the things that they've recently heard from both Theresa and Neil, but also share sort of their position on the topic and some of the things that they're doing to create different kinds of futures. And after that, we will enter into sort of a more casual conversation. I've invited them to be asking questions of each other. I can moderate it a bit, but I think we'll have plenty of to say in a short amount of time that we have. So first, we will be hearing from Professor Joe Stromando. He is at San Diego State University. He's an associate professor of philosophy there, and also the director of the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs. After Joe, we will hear from Dr. Sarah Hendren. She is an associate professor at Olin College, currently on sabbatical because she is doing a fellow at New America where she focuses on educational policy. She is also the author of a recent book called What Can a Body Do? I use it as a teaching tool in my classrooms. It's wonderful. Check it out. And also she's the PI on a program called Sketch Model. And they're really thinking about how to bring in humanistic disciplines into engineering education. So really important work. And lastly, we'll hear from Dr. Keolu Fox. He is an assistant professor at UC San Diego. He is in the Department of Global Health, Anthropology. He's also part of the Data Sciences Institute and the Climate Action Lab at UC San Diego. He is also the co-founder of a really important organization called the Indigenous Futures Institute. Check it out. I'll throw some of this stuff in the chat, as well as the Native Biodata Consortia. So first, Joe, we would love to hear from you and your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. This is a real pleasure. One of the things that is so exciting to me about this conference is that we're talking about eugenics in terms that don't frame it as just sort of a historical artifact, right? I think a lot of times when folks think about eugenics, they try to sort of drive a wedge between this concept of, what Oliver Wendell Holmes was talking about and what the Nazis were doing and sort of the bad eugenics, and then, what we have now with CRISPR and so on and so forth, and try to frame things as if we've really gone, quite a ways away from some of those regressive kinds of attitudes. And I think that the pandemic, it should just sort of talk about something that might at first blush seem unrelated. The pandemic really threw into sharp relief for me and for other disabled people, just how far we still have to go when it comes to eugenic attitudes. The social discourse and social policies that came along with the pandemic really validated, I think, a lot of the anxieties that many disabled people experience when they think about whether or not their lives are equally valued by the rest of society. We were told over and over again by the media that only those with pre-existing conditions were at serious risk of death, which is, of course, of no comfort if you are one of those people. And this was especially troubling when these reminders were put in the context of justifications for scaling back different kinds of precautions and opening society back up again and so on. Further, an even more dramatic example of this is crisis standards of care that were put in place to triage critical care like ventilators and so on and so forth. And many of these explicitly deprioritized disabled people and made it so that if they were activated, different conditions that have nothing to do with the survivability of COVID, like, for instance, intellectual disabilities and so on, would put one at a disadvantage for receiving COVID treatment. So while eugenics is sort of a slippery term and somewhat vague, I think one plausible interpretation of it, one important interpretation of it, is that it constitutes this kind of social attitude that disabled people, or sometimes people that are mistakenly regarded as disabled, if they're non-white, for instance, don't have an equal right to social resources or to life itself. And so I think the pandemic sort of brought all of this back up and into the foreground again, that this is not some kind of historical thing, but is a very clear and present social force that is acting right now. And so just to sort of quickly circle it back around to CRISPR, this creates worries, right, for conversations about CRISPR and how we can talk about CRISPR in a more productive way. Namely, this seems to provide kind of a pretty hostile context to thinking about disability being anything other than just sort of this straightforward harm, right? It sort of provides these background assumptions that disability is bad. And so to sort of build off of some of what we've already heard in terms of Theresa's work on disability or deaf gain, or Rosemary Garland Thompson's work on conserving disability, right? It's much easier to sort of dismiss these kinds of ideas about disability being compatible with or even part of a life of flourishing. It's very easy to dismiss that when you have these strong social attitudes sort of in the background. And so I want to suggest that a lot of our conversation needs to be focused on, and it's funny for a philosopher to argue this, right? But focused on sort of looking closely at the lived experiences of actual disabled people, right? And so in other words, have sort of a bioethics that takes a more of an empirical turn, right? And that looks at disability and all of the varied experiences of disability and all of its complexity when we ask hard questions about what counts as human flourishing, and rather than rely on just sort of these simplistic stereotypes and stigmas around what people presume it is like to live with various kinds of disabilities. And so it's through this kind of orientation that we can have a better, more productive conversation about how the technology should be used.
Thank you, Joe. Joe also wrote I'm going to try and find it and put it in the chat. You wrote a really interesting piece about eugenics and disability recently. I'm going to try and find that and throw in that link too for people to continue learning. Sarah.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for including me today. And so many good thoughts have been offered. I'm here, yes, coming from a context of technology at Olin College of Engineering, where I teach about assistive and adaptive technologies. And I have just written a book about this matter, not just as a civil rights matter that was waiting on the kind of inclusion via legal measures like the ADA, as important as that was, but to try to establish that there has been a long time creative tradition of making and remaking the world such that its very structures are more flexible for all kinds of atypical bodies and minds. So if you look at the radical history and the inventive history of creating curb cuts, for example, widespread closed captioning, to say nothing of all the small product scale tools and devices that we use, each of us uses, no matter the state of our bodies, then we'd find actually this rich intellectual and creative and designerly tradition, again, of making and remaking that world in desirable futures that encompass more of us more at the time. So that is my context as a humanist. My training is actually in the arts and history, design studies, and so on. But I'm interested here and invested today in current technologies, yes, the kind of specter of CRISPR, in part because I'm also the mother of a child with Down syndrome. He's 15 now, I have 3 children. And so I come to this conversation, always a little bit surprised to hear new instantiations that and calls for us to begin to talk about the kinds of, as we say, promises and perils. Why? Because, well, there has been proceeding for decades, one private autonomous choice at a time, nonetheless, an aggregate eugenics program that is actually culling the population of people with Down syndrome throughout the world, including in countries, rich countries of the world with strong social programs and universal healthcare and lifespan supports. And so what I find actually is that there are lots of affirmative conversations like this one that we should grapple with the ethical kinds of conundrums here. That is to say, the collision course between women's reproductive autonomy and the kind of lives worth living, non-utilitarian, dignity-based ideas about personhood that we'd want to affirm. And my observation is that there's quite a lot of reluctance to build courageously from the many global wisdom traditions of the world or other kinds of philosophical and democratic rights traditions, a robust enough theory of personhood to actually give us some traction here. And I confess again, a disappointment that we imagine that somehow the conversation is brand new because we are talking about CRISPR and gene editing, when again, there has been a kind of genetic flag for Down syndrome for a long time, and the eminent capacity and the deployment of technologies around what in the end is a kind of utilitarian valuation of human life. The stuff is really tricky. It is really complicated, but I want to just say as strongly as possible that we actually do need the courage to seek those first principles wherever they may lead us, and to grapple with the really hard questions about whose lives are worth living indeed, because it's already here. So, you know, I have much more to say, but I want Keola to weigh in here. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Kayla, my friend.
Yes, thank you so much. One for having me and just having this really important conversation about eugenics research. I think that first and foremost, I would just like to say that it's not gone away, right? Like we have these new modalities and methods for different types of measurement theory. And I think that's kind of the position that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. I'm actually a genome scientist. I'm the first Native Hawaiian to receive a PhD in genome sciences, which is both tremendous. My mom's proud, but also very sad because it shows the limited types of ideation processes and philosophies and worldviews that a lot of our scientific community is bringing into the technologies that we build, how we apply them, and mostly in really extractive and racist ways. And again, we can look back at the kind of the history of eugenic research, and we can see that there's all these ways to measure and give names, and it's always one community who's kind of providing the naming. We wrote about this in Nature recently. If you take a racist box and you put a type of wrapping paper on it that has 3 colors, and they're Negroid, Causoid, and Mongoloid, and then in 2021 the wrapping paper now has 300 colors, it's still about who's providing the naming, who has the agency of doing that. And in a lot of times the way we interpret even genome sequence data, I'm not talking about editing yet, okay, we'll get there, we now are in a really, really strange place because people who interpret that data have power. People who train any form of machine learning algorithm have power because they're introducing all of these different forms of bias. So when we look at whose genomes are being sequenced and who's sequencing them, David Reich, I'm looking at you, and I'm hoping that your institution pulls your funding because you continue to hammer on and perform science that is completely unethical, and scientifically in a lot of ways, a lot of the ways in which we're revisiting where communities come from and the validity of those scientific questions, they're not scientifically accurate either. So you can't both violate human rights in terms of ethics and do bad science in terms of the way you're interpreting the data. So what we've done through the Indigenous Futures Institute is we're saying, what are the questions that our communities want to prioritize with these technologies? What will we use these technologies to do? If it's sequencing, then how are we thinking about the impact of many, many different things and how it's related to disease? How do we connect our diaspora to our disease susceptibility and these sorts of ideas? And then if it's editing, it's why are we allowing people to narrativize and create correlation-based ideas around mutations that are discovered or that are under selection from the sort of population genetics point of view? And we can actually use CRISPR, Cas9 genome editing, to create accountability. We can use a reverse genetics approach and say, you said this mutation did this, but now when I see it in an isogenic cell line, it actually doesn't do what you're saying. It's not a thrifty mutation. It's not associated with what you're saying. And I'm happy to elaborate on some of these things, but it's all about how we wield the tools of measurement and genome editing, and how we create agency and empower our communities rather than, discrediting, many, many things that Indigenous people have done. But thanks again for having me. Thank you,
Keolu, and I think maybe everyone will now come join me on the big screen. Yeah, thank you. I think what we gather from just what we've heard from the three of you is how baked in and embedded these ideologies are around superiority, racism, ableism, settler colonial mentalities within the scientific space, and of course in all sorts of systems within our society. So when we teach this to our students, it's overwhelming. It's like, where do you start? How do you dismantle this, and how do you shine light on it, and then how do you build anew? And so I think there's been some things that have been brought up specifically. One, there's research that likely just shouldn't be occurring, and the questions that are being asked, and thinking about that and looking at that really seriously, how we educate and teach in our classrooms, and then who's making decisions, at all these decision-making points, within the labs, within the government, within biotech. I mean, let's be clear, Dr. Baer brought up sickle cell in CRISPR. Sickle cell disease, up until a few years ago, is one of the most understudied diseases, in America. And why is that? Because it primarily affects people with African ancestry. Cystic fibrosis, which normally hits folks of European ancestry, is 17 times more funded than sickle cell. And then we get a nice sort of low-hanging fruit of an easy mutation to correct with CRISPR, and all of a sudden we're curing sickle cell. And if you look at CRISPR Therapeutics and who's in the leadership on that company, making tons of money and making all these choices, not a single person is African American, right? So you just see it play out over and over again. So I'm going to kind of throw it back at you, and this is, I know, not an easy question, and anyone can take it. What do we do? How do we start to work together and change things? It looks like Keolu's about to bounce out of his seat, so I'll throw it to him first.
I'm chomping at the bit. I think that's an interesting observation too about the 17-to-1 ratio. I mean, and we know that Vertex Pharmaceuticals, who put this new cystic fibrosis drug on the market, worked with a patient advocacy group, recruited them, sequenced their genomes, refined their intellectual property, and then put that drug back on the market for $300,000 a year. Now, if you know anything about policy, you're probably doing the same thing I am and saying, this is a violation of the common rule. There shouldn't be infrastructure and insurance policy that supports the development of drugs like this, because that drug probably is very, very, very efficient for that community of people. But how did that happen, right? And we don't want to see that happen in the future, especially when it happens to do with communities of, historically marginalized communities. And then when we look at the numbers of pharmaceutical, clinical trials who are we actually recruiting? And you'll be, I mean, you're probably not shocked that 95% of clinical trials include individuals of Western European ancestry, right? White people. We're not charting an honest trajectory that reflects the diversity we see every day in places like California, or where I'm from, Hawaii, the most diverse state by a country mile. So what do? Well, we have started Variant Bio, and we're looking to create a much more honest perspective. We're actually providing equity for the communities that participate in this, both long-term and short-term benefit sharing. We're completely shattering the status quo and disrupting the way that people develop drugs in the future. And I think it's a really culturally sustainable model. And I'm hoping that it puts pressure on the 23andMe's and the Vertexes of the world, because the current trajectory is not sustainable. And it's honestly almost a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. So.
Yes, I could offer some thoughts as far as what we do. While she was talking about PGD and IVF and not CRISPR, I think some of Dorothy Roberts's work is informative here. Thinking about Killing the Black Body in the last chapter of that, where she talks about how we need to develop technologies that address the concerns of the common good, rather than the concerns of sort of the moneyed elite kind of thing, right? And so I think we need to look at that orientation, especially when we're talking about public funding for the development of various technologies, right? A lot of these drugs and so on and so forth are, originating with federal grant money. And so when we look at how public monies are used, there needs to be better parity between developing CRISPR at all, right, and developing sort of these pharmaceutical biotech interventions at all, and developing other kinds of technologies that can more directly help people, where they are and as they are, right? You look at the money being spent on developing CRISPR, and then you look at the fact that people in Flint still don't have clean water, right? And it's just it's horrifying to me. And so I think that looking at better funding parity with how money is used, especially public funds, would be one important thing that we could do.
Yeah, and I guess I just will make a strong case for humanities education, including a kind of a deeper and more comparative, deeper into history set of literacies about these ancient questions, which is what has constituted a human self. Also, the very notion of the common good, the role of the virtues and their practice in building our happiness, the essentially social nature of our collective happiness. These are not new ideas, and they're not merely a kind of progressive critique of Enlightenment ideas that we might be fighting against with a kind of historical amnesia about the way that many cultures and in many times have grappled with these very same questions. And if we feel ourselves drawn back to those traditions, we'll be better equipped to resist the kind of presentism of today, and also to fight and chip away at our narrow sphere of rights matters without the kind of philosophical grounding that they really beg us for. That's
Could I add on to what Tara said? Just a brief thought too. It's that we've seen how successful mRNA vaccines have been over the last year. These technologies will only become more ubiquitous, whether it's various forms of augmenting gene regulation or, or actual, gene therapy. And I think that there's going to be more intense interest. There's going to be buku bucks that goes into this. And it's kind of our responsibility to put pressure on these institutions, companies, to make them more ethical. And so if we just sit back here and wait, you can expect a brave new world of health disparities. So
yeah, and I mean, I think this builds on exactly what we've seen with the pandemic, right? mRNA vaccines, incredibly successful. I don't know what the numbers are right now. I think it's like 4% of low-income countries, people have been vaccinated. You know, so it shows how powerful these social structures are and how much work we have as scientists and non-scientists alike to change them. One thing that comes to mind, and I'm curious to just get your opinions on this, if we think about sort of the, you know, bioethics is obviously coming up a lot today. It's having like a heyday with these technologies and you know, all of these things we faced as well in the pandemic. And some of the major inadequacies of bioethics education right now. Theresa kind of mentioned some of this too, and the voids there. One thing that I feel strongly about is, you know, how inadequate utilitarian approaches are to these sorts of conversations and to the discussions we need, and how important it is to be thinking about sort of relational ethics. Much coming from sort of feminist philosophy and sort of indigenous philosophies as well, thinking about relation and how we are in relation with each other. The question is, how do we actually start building that into our systems, right? And I wonder if people have sort of things to mention about that. And again, just sort of these underpinnings of how we even approach these kinds of complicated and conversations and questions.
I guess talking about utilitarianism, I ought to say something as the philosopher on the panel. I think that that sometimes, you know, from a policy perspective, you can't help but be utilitarian, right? And so, you know, when, you know, just sort of thinking about some of these questions around the coronavirus pandemic that has, you know, sort of been in the foreground of everyone's thought over the past couple of years. You know, you have to kind of almost take a utilitarian approach to some of these questions, right? And so my answer is not necessarily to sort of completely abandon utilitarian ethics, because I think that they can be sort of almost necessary, but not have sort of a ham-fisted utilitarian ethics, right? Not have a utilitarian ethics that's just sort of built upon all of the prejudices and stigmas and everything else that you know, are baked into our social structures. So I guess my thought would be, you know, when you must use sort of a utilitarian orientation because of, you know, the scale or the scope of the problems you're trying to solve, do it in a way that is well informed about, you know, what the good actually is, rather than just sort of going off of, you know, whatever prejudicial assumptions you might have.
So maybe in closing, we don't have a huge amount of time left. I'm gonna throw something at each of you to kind of think about. As we make change and thinking about the spaces that we work in, I'm first curious to kind of hear Sarah's ideas about changing the classrooms. You know, Joe's ideas about changing sort of policy and how we make choices. And Keolu's ideas about changing some of these sort of knowledge production systems outside of, within the institutions, but also outside of how we're, you know, working with data, et cetera. Sarah, let's hear it.
Yeah, and then I may have to jump off. I do have an event at 2. I'm so glad to have been here today. I guess I'll pick up on something that Joe said earlier about sort of returning to the empirical, dimensional, you know, individual lives and lives worth living that can happen in a classroom, and that kind of engagement one-to-one, the highly local, in particular, lives of people who are unlike ourselves, those have a way of implanting stories in our brains that don't go away. We bet on this at Olin by doing kind of ethnographic work up front when we do design and collaborative design with people who are unlike ourselves. In other words, the rich qualitative kind of interview style. What does this person care about? What is their definition of success, what are the kinds of ecosystems in which they're involved? What are their actual named challenges rather than our abstract imposed idea of what a challenge is in their lives? And again, at a highly local in particular, that is the sort of humanist inflection to the abstraction of technology writ large, but having that kind of highly local and convivial interaction about what is it that we might build together, what are the desirable technologies of the future. I do think that students have a kind of aha where they say, you know, in a universal way, this person surprised me over and over again. I didn't expect to hear what I did hear. We have more in common than I imagined. I was also taught and shown things that I had never considered before. And my bet then is that they will go, in my case, they'll go to software companies and be working mostly with kind of big data systems and abstractions, but that those stories I'm betting on, right, that in 10, 15, 20 years, for instance, in the assistive adaptive realm, if they're making an app and wondering how it works with a screen reader, that they'll be unafraid, at least, to make the call to the Association for the Blind that's there and not be afraid of the inherent awkwardness, yes, of talking with someone unlike yourself, but there's no substitute for it after all. So that is a kind of relational model of change that I think needs practice and muscles built for it. That's what I'd say.
I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add to what Sarah just said.
That was good.
I almost feel like just do that, but with policymakers. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what I was referring to when I was talking about sort of reframing utilitarian ethics, right? Sort of creating a relational model of ethics that then underscores these broad policy decisions, right? And so yeah, I mean, I think that would be sort of the direction that I would encourage folks to move in, to, you know, think about the lived experience of folks, what they actually want, what they actually need in their lives, in all of the rich context of those lives, right? And sort of looking at the intersections too, I think is incredibly important, right? In that, you know, something that Theresa Blankmeyer Burke said earlier, right? There is no one experience of disability. And the reason why there's no one experience of disability is because of those intersections, right? All of the different interlocking and overlapping identities and oppressions that can sort of act as lenses through which the disability experience flows. And so, you know, looking at the full complexity of all of that is what we need to do as we design technologies and as we think about to what ends we are putting our social resources.
Just to add on what both Sarah and Joe said so elegantly, I think that if we stop and ask ourselves a very simple question, what happens when we stop optimizing every single technology for profit and, unfortunately, exponential growth? What happens? What happens when you have an attention to detail for local complexity, whether it is the actual application of a technology for a specific community and a specific individual? I think you're going to get twice as much innovation. So when we get into the ecosystems of innovation that exist, it's like we're just pouring money and resources into the La Joillas and the Cambridges and the Bay Areas. And really, we're just reproducing the same ideas and creating these very strange forms of competition that exist that exacerbate a lot of problems. I think if we had a more distributed approach to innovation, we would come up with better ideas and we would just naturally achieve more equitable outcomes. And I think that this is no different in the space of genomics and the applications in health and many other things, and, you know, the climate crisis. I just wish we could have more attention to detail there, and the impact would be profound. So I just leave everybody with that, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all three of you. We could keep chatting, I'm sure, for hours, but I know we all have other things we have to do. I've learned so much, and I also just, in closing, want to plug some of the work we're also doing at Harvard. I help lead curriculum development at the Scientific Citizenship Initiative at Harvard Medical School, where we're partnering with all sorts of folks, including people like Keulu and Sarah, to really think about how to create a more responsible science and create a scientific culture that really gives attention to these relationships and the skills that are needed to be in dialogue with those different from ourselves. So check that out. And check out also some of the courses that we offer. There's a lot of learning to do, and we certainly don't need to do it on our own. So thank you again. And now we will move on to our next panel, which will be moderated by Charlene Gallarno. She is faculty at the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School, a wonderful, brilliant, beautiful woman who I adore as well and have learned a lot from. And I know we'll be hearing some really, really interesting and great things from her panel centered on Vermont.
Natalie, thanks so much. That was wonderful. It was a great panel. And what's really interesting is the ways I think that we in this next panel are going to do some of the things that your panelists actually asked about: lived experiences, local places. Each one of you mentioned social forces, that have been, we might think of in the past, but certainly aren't in the past, very much in our present. So we're going to move actually right now out of the scientific and particularly the genomic realm. And we are going to look at Vermont. And so if you've been with us through the past conferences, this is sort of the third installment of Vermont, and it's about Vermont Futures. And we're calling it Dismantling Vermont Eugenics Toward an Anti-Eugenics Future. And what's so exciting about this is we have three incredible people joining us, three Vermonters who have been involved in issues around eugenics for some time. Judy Dow, the executive director of Gadakana, House Representative Tiffany Bloomley, and Senator Kesharam Hinsdale, the last two being policymakers, which were also asked about in the last panel. All three people have been involved in the construction of the Vermont apology. As you might imagine, these are three very busy people. And so for scheduling reasons, we actually recorded these presentations and conversation last week. But you can still put any questions in the Q&A or the chat. And we will have with us Representative Bloomley and Judy Dow, the final session of today's conference, so starting about 3:20. So with that, let's begin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Vermont segment of this final Legacies of Eugenics in New England conference. My name is Charlene Gallarno. I'm faculty at Harvard Medical School, the Center for Bioethics, also the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and I am Vermont born and a current resident of Vermont. This session, Dismantling Vermont Eugenics Toward an Anti-Eugenic Future, follows two earlier sessions in September and October that explored Vermont eugenics in the past and in the present. Let me begin with a screen share here. So to begin today, I return us to the tapestries created by Vermont artist Judy Dow, which opened the entire New England conference back in September. You may recognize this Founder's Tree 1921 as a representation of the now iconic image of the Second International Congress on Eugenics held in 1921 in New York City. Here, Judy repeats the words of that image. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And like a tree, eugenics draws materials from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity. This next tapestry, the Witness Tree of 2021, is Judy's vision of how we might reimagine the tree today and for the future. Her words are, anti-eugenics is the collective creation of an equitable and healthy world for all. Like a tree, anti-eugenics draws from many sources and transforms them into a one mind and one heart way of being. And it is this transformation from Vermont eugenics to anti-eugenics that we explore today. And to do this, we're incredibly fortunate to have with us three Vermonters who have been deeply engaged in many different aspects around eugenics in the state of Vermont. We have Judy Dow, Vermont artist and educator, as well as the executive director of Gadakana, a Native American experiential outdoor education and leadership development organization. We have Representative Tiffany Bloomley, member of the Vermont House of Representatives, as well as a member of the House Committee on General Housing and Military Affairs that held numerous public hearings on JRH2, otherwise known as the Vermont Apology for Eugenics. And we have Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale, member of the Vermont Senate, also on the Senate Committee on Government Operations, which too held hearings on the opposed apology. Each panelist will speak briefly, 5 to 7 minutes, sharing with us their thoughts about eugenics and anti-eugenics. And after that, we'll bring them together on screen for a conversation among themselves, which I'm very excited to hear. So let us begin with Judy Dow, Vermont educator and artist. See, Judy, there you are.
Good morning. Yes, I'd like to start with something I've just written in response to the question, what would or could a future look like without eugenics? For me, the story of the land always comes first. The theft of our land has taken so much from us: a clean environment, a relationship with the land as kin, an understanding between a want and a need, and a way of life where all living and non-living things are equal. My wish for the future would be that our state agencies like Agency of Natural Resource and Forestry, Parks and Rec, and others directly connected with land would look at the land as kin and not as something to degrade, exploit, or rape. We only harvest low-grade wood and defective wood, a quote, still appears in the forester's language. I wish it would disappear from their everyday language and the forest would not be seen as a natural resource to be used only to make money. Every day, trees are harvested from wetlands because they are considered, quote, low grade, defective, or degraded, unquote. They are used as a pulpwood to make wood pellets. To me, the trees in the wetlands are high grade because they make the best trees for baskets. They are huge storage containers for carbon, and they provide homes for those living in the wetlands. Economy and natural resources should not be the number one thing people consider every time they think of the land. People should understand there is a long relationship between eugenics and conservationists, and that relationship must get better if we are to fight climate change. The removal of thousands of low-grade and defective trees is disrupting a natural ecosystem and the natural storage of carbon. This storage will help to slow climate change. We need these trees. A world without eugenics would be a world where folks recognize that land is our kin and treat her as a relative and recognize we are in a climate crisis now. When the destruction of our land is everywhere and folks don't recognize it, how can we have an expectation for folks to recognize eugenics elsewhere in their daily life? For instance, some of the politicians in our lives have spoken about, quote, having good genes or believing in the racehorse theory, or, quote, they love to just tell us that they come from good stock. These words are direct echoes from the past eugenicists. As H.G. Wells once wrote, the way of nature has always been to slay the hindmost, and there is still no other way, unless we can prevent those who would become the hindmost from being born. A world without eugenics would be one where there was equity for all. I often use the metaphor to explain climate change. We are leaving the world we know, a world where we have explored plants and animals and fish and birds and so many others. We are traveling through the Narrows to get to a new world where all systems we know well will be broken. As we prepare to go through the Narrows from the world we know today into an unknown world, we must help those stuck in the Narrows between two worlds. We live in a world of those that have and those that have not. The Narrows will be difficult to cross because those that will most often be stuck in the Narrows are those that are houseless, those that are disabled, and those that live a different lifestyle. What this means is that when we are traveling through the Narrows due to climate change, eugenics will be thriving once again. We can see it all around us today. Those that can afford to buy their way out through the Narrows will, and those that cannot afford to buy their way through the Narrows will struggle to survive. Many will not make it. A future without eugenics would be one where people helped each other, regardless of who they were, a world where there would be equity for all. The eugenicists of the past worked hard to break up families, history, continuity, and community. Take the children and institute the elders was important to the plan. Kill the Indian and save the man was the chant that Richard Pratt used to promote Carlisle boarding school for Native children, an institution from which 13 children from 13 Wabanaki families were sent. Today, folks are trying to get laws like Indian child welfare overturned. This law doesn't allow people to take our children from us, adopt them, and allow them to be raised by white folks. Non-Native people still believe today that they know best, and they want to raise our children that way, their way. On the opposite side of this discussion, the Native American Grave Protection and Reparation Act allows our burial sites and grave goods to be protected, yet human remains and burial artifacts still sit on museum shelves, and you can frequently find them for sale by ignorant people hoping to make thousands of dollars off our culture and history. These internet sales are much like the advertisements in the newspaper of the 1920s that Professor Harrison Wilder from Smith College in Massachusetts would place when he wanted, quote, Indian skeletons for his teachings and eugenics work. $5 for a whole skeleton, the advertisement would say. He would barter and trade for specific body parts like people do today for antique car parts. A future without eugenics would treat our burial sites with the same respect that others a future without eugenics would treat our burial sites with the same respect that other cemeteries receive and allow us to raise our children and care for our elders within our communities and with the lifeways that we choose. Disrespecting the land, destroying people's lives by breaking up families and communities, changing laws and treaties that protect us are just a few of the issues eugenicists of the past and present have in common. Repeating history is all around us because some have fallen asleep and have forgotten our history and others simply don't care. We are repeating eugenics again. Wake up, it's all around you. And thank you. And I'd like to introduce Representative Tiff Bloomley from Burlington.
Hi, hello, Judy. That was really quite wonderful, and I really appreciated what you said. My name's Tiffany Bloomley, and I live in Burlington, Vermont, and I represent the city's South End as a state representative. The amazing women here in this panel have helped me to recognize the ways in which eugenics has had generational reverberations, and that it continues to undergird public policy and debate, and of my responsibility to address it. When I zoomed in for our committee's hearings on a proposed apology for the Vermont legislature's role in promoting and funding eugenics, I listened to Charlene, Judy, members of the Commission on Native American Affairs, and advocates and members of the disabilities community. What I initially absorbed was the story of a pseudoscientific debunked discipline promoted by Vermont institutions and political leaders over a specific period of time. I hadn't appreciated the ways in which eugenics helped erase or drive Indigenous culture and identity underground. And the words of one witness were especially chilling. As a school child in the 1940s and 50s, she said, "I was taught that no Indians lived in Vermont. They only hunted and traveled through this area. As my cousin and I sought more information on our Native American heritage, my aunt told us, first, they find out all about you. Then they come for you." This was in the 1990s. She told us nothing more. But even if we recognize the ways in which eugenics has played out generationally, we continue to make the mistake of compartmentalizing eugenics as a thing of the past. Eugenics, the idea that some human lives are more valuable than others, lies at the heart of all injustice and marginalization today. And we have a responsibility to name it as such. Sometimes the connection to eugenics is obvious. The revelation that until 2010, California's correctional institutions had performed involuntary sterilizations, and that doctors in ICE detention centers had performed involuntary hysterectomies. The fact that from 2002 to 2013, Native children in Maine entered foster care at more than 5 times the rate of non-Native children. But our real challenge, and certainly my specific challenge as a white woman, is to recognize the myriad and sometimes subtler ways in which eugenics continues to animate current policy practice and public debate. How else to understand policies that failed to prioritize vaccinations for incarcerated people when they were among those most vulnerable to COVID-19? Or the failure of our Department of Health to notify BIPOC families of the availability of a vaccine for children? Or the fact that we did not initially publicize COVID public service materials in any language but English? How else can we understand the failure of states to allow trans citizens to change ID cards to match their gender identity or to protect them from hate crimes? Are not minimum wage exceptions an expression of eugenics? Or our failure to muster the political will to insist upon safe housing for farm workers? Or, as Judy has so eloquently pointed out, protecting the integrity and wholeness of our earth? As the head of a nonprofit, I learned over time to assess a new program idea through the lens of 5 questions. Is it consistent with mission? Are we the appropriate lead? Do we have relationships with the partners that we need? Is it sustainable over the long haul? And do we currently have the capacity to do it, or the desire and time to develop that capacity? As a legislator, I have the same obligation to weigh current law and proposed legislation through a similar kind of lens, one that's focused on social equity. What are the social equity impacts of this particular decision? And are they consistent with our broader social equity goals? Whose voices have we heard from, and whose voices might have been excluded or overlooked? Are the agencies that will carry out a policy equipped to anticipate and respond to the needs of all community members? Or do they need help in anticipating those needs? Perhaps the most important thing we can do as lawmakers is to assume that we have missed voices, that we have not anticipated the impact of our actions on Vermont's most vulnerable or marginalized people. I'm really grateful for what the women on this panel have taught me and many of us through the work and research that you've done thus far, and for what you'll no doubt continue to teach us in the months and years ahead. I hope you will hold my feet to the fire and be your partner in dismantling eugenics from the inside out. Thank you. I now have the great honor of passing the torch to a good friend and a woman I admire greatly, Keisha Ram, who is a senator from Chittenden County.
Thanks so much, Tiff. It is a real honor and privilege to follow you and Judy in this critical discussion. We're at an important moment in our understanding of how to proceed with medical care in the face of a pandemic, how to understand disparities in race, income, and other markers of identity and lived experience. I want to start by just acknowledging that in Vermont, many of these things are related and have led to deep disparities. Some might be more obvious, like the fact that for Black Vermonters at any time during the pandemic, they were 3 to 10 times more likely to be infected with COVID-19. There were similar statistics for Asian Americans in Vermont. And so often when we look at those kinds of statistics, the Indigenous community is once again left out or erased, even though we know in the country, Indigenous First Nations residents and tribal residents also had deep disparities. We started to see and understand that in our own state, but weren't collecting clear enough information. And in fact, we had a painful experience where we had a resolution advanced, and it made sense that it came largely from the Black community in Vermont to declare racism as a public health emergency. And as that moved through the legislature, toward the end of the deliberation, it was made clear that we had omitted the experience of Indigenous Vermonters in that resolution. And so throughout history, from our original sins, you see the deep divides that allow us to continue to subjugate or treat differently Black Americans from a history of enslavement, and to erase the experiences of our Indigenous earlier inhabitants of what we now consider Vermont or the United States. And so that still permeates our experiences in policy and our outcomes in a healthcare system where, like politics, we see that the least represented people in leadership and decision-making are often young women who are of reproductive age, and young women of reproductive age who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And so, we also have to, as Tiff started to point out, look beyond where we see that show up in medical care and access to medical care, trust in the healthcare system, to other facets of who deserves to be, sorry, my dog's a little grumbly, who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, whether they have substance use disorder or have gotten entangled with the criminal justice system, and who deserves harsh punishment. So in Chittenden County, the county I represent and Tiff serves within as well, the largest county in the state, young Black men make up 2.5% of the youth population, but 25% of those charged as youthful offenders in the criminal justice system. So who we believe is desirable, undesirable, a criminal versus someone who needs more interventions and support that are medical in nature rather than criminal or punitive in nature, those are still all built on those original sins of enslavement and erasure and genocide. And so we have an obligation to continue to look at all of our facets of society for our responsibility to name and root out those deep disparities built on a legacy of subjugation and essentially racism. So that's what I wanted to add. I think it was part of the reason, I think are spurred to have this conversation is the state took a very preliminary step, apologizing for the history of eugenics in our state. And not only did we, sanction and engage in eugenics, the University of Vermont was the place that housed a professor of zoology who led the American Eugenics Survey. So we were an intellectual place of advancing eugenics. And we look at, our influence on other genocides, attempted genocides and atrocities around the world, such as the Holocaust. And we see that we had communication and involvement. So, we as Vermonters need to also stop and recognize, that there are some reasons why our state may now be considered the second whitest in the country. And so we have to heal from that legacy. And not only did we take a long time to apologize, we took a long time to reckon with that truth. We buried records. We made it very difficult for people to figure out if their families had been named and had been impacted. And so people had to live with silence and re-victimization and trauma for a long period of time. And that should teach us really important lessons, not only about us committing atrocities through government or through healthcare, but how we reckon with that past and instead of burying it. Thank you. And I'm happy to turn it back over to Charlene to engage us in discussion.
All right. I think I'm unmuted at this point. Wow, you all have given us so much to think about, and I so appreciate that you've taken us beyond the sort of conventional eugenics story and really helped us to see eugenics today and how that plays out in certain practices and ideas that we have. It's phenomenal. Let me give you first a few minutes. I'm sure things you said and you heard from one another may have sparked some additional things people want to say or questions you might want to ask one another. So let me just give you that opportunity before I jump in with any questions. Is there anything you heard from each other that you'd like to respond to? And that's open to anyone.
Keisha, when I heard you give the statistics from the Chittenden County Correctional Facility, I worked there at their high school. So as you probably know, in Vermont, it's mandatory if you're incarcerated between the ages of 17 and 23 that you get a degree. And so the largest high school in the state is in the correctional facility. The one thing that I found interesting was when I had to mail home projects that students completed, their addresses were in the exact same neighborhoods that were targeted in the eugenics in the 20s and 30s. And I was actually amazed by that. And I don't know why I was, but I was amazed that I was sending them to the same houses. But I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you, Judy. If I could just say, I mean, every time I hear Judy speak, I'm incredibly struck by her deep sense of place and how we often forget that the flora, the fauna, the land, the other living beings around us are, a consideration, are part of our story, and who is able to access beauty, where people live, the air that they breathe, the homes that they live in that are inhabited by ancestors and other voices, the trauma that's been experienced in certain neighborhoods, that lives with us in ways that, often shows up in medical conditions and clusters of, a lack of health and well-being for certain communities. And so, I always appreciate that Judy brings in the other voices and beings into the space that are, affecting us, and we have a relationship with, whether or not we're conscious of it all the time.
And another thing that has been of interest for me lately has been the use of the word sustainable or sustainability. I've been working on the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee of Climate Council, and they use it all the time there. And I can't remember who mentioned it today, somebody did. But to me, I'm beginning to form a different definition around that, and more, instead of being sustainable, being able to thrive and flourish. And that's what we need. We need for our economy, for our people, for our land, to be able to find balance so that they can all thrive together and flourish together, not put more power over economy than people or land. Would anybody like to share anything on that?
Well, I mean, I think that I think I use the word sustainable because I was in the context of talking about my nonprofit and was a program sustainable or not. And you're right. I mean, the what's behind that question is a desire for something to flourish, to have the opportunity to grow. And one of the things that I've been really wrestling with over the last 18 months is the impact of the pandemic on our ability to seek to help whole communities thrive and flourish. I'm a hopeful person. It's why I went to eventually ran for the legislature. It's why I've always done the work that I've done. And yet I think that the disparities that exist and the stress of people's lives, can create an environment in which, no, you're just mostly interested in yourself, your family. Can we get through this? And so I'm wondering how others read the current time, because I think that dismantling eugenics or a eugenics approach to things really requires being very consciously aware of other people, their needs, and this interconnectedness that you talk about so beautifully, Judy. And at any rate, I just throw that out there because I want to remain hopeful. And I think that it's a challenge. It's a special challenge right now.
One of you in different ways. Oh, go ahead, Judy. Sorry.
I'm really glad that she's hopeful. I'd hate to be living in a state full of legislators that weren't.
That's great. So each one of you has talked about, one way or another, responsibility or accountability. And you just raised, Tiff, one of the sort of obstacles in this context that we're in now, the pandemic, and this sort of narrow way of thinking of ourselves and not seeing our interdependence and being connected. I'm wondering if you could speak to, all of you, what are some of the obstacles you see standing in the way of the kind of future you'd like to create? And if you'd rather not go with obstacles, maybe what are some of the assets? What are some of the resources you see in Vermont for creating that vision of an anti-eugenic future, moving away from these eugenic policies, which you all so beautifully described, the way they are embedded in our health disparities and our criminal justice system disparities, in the kinds of questions we ask. So what do you see as either in the way, if you will, or resources for really moving forward?
Well, I'm always happy to start with obstacles because I think there are many. And, I know Judy does this too, but I talk to groups of young people who say, oh, the Holocaust could never happen here. Some of these atrocities around the world could never happen here. We don't even teach about the eugenics movement in Vermont or in the country. It takes I've talked to college classes on the Holocaust, and they have no idea what took place at their own university. And so the ability to point fingers at the South, over our history with the Civil War and slavery, the ability to point fingers at, parts of Europe, the South is reckoning with some of those statutes and some of that history. And we can certainly observe and have commentary about that, but we should really look at ourselves, and that's probably going to be more valuable work. You look at places in Europe like Germany that have not let people forget what happened, albeit they might be imperfect in their approach, but it's built into their education system to be having conversations about how to avoid the same historical mistakes. So I just don't want Vermonters to think that we're immune to the great downfalls of our history and we're barely teaching our young people what happened. So, unless we transmit wisdom and learning, however painful it may be, we are going to repeat the same mistakes and find the same patterns. And then I think a huge barrier is data. I mean, the statistic I just shared is not widely known to people about the over-incarceration and over-criminalization of young Black men. We don't have great data in Vermont, even as an example with the unemployment experience that we had this year. We knew that at one point in time, women made up 70% of those experiencing unemployment compared to men. And that was startling. That was wildly out of sync, even with other outliers in the country. So we're trying to figure out what's happening to women, what's happening to their kids, what's happening to the jobs they're in. And again, women of reproductive age, single women are highly underrepresented in our systems of government, which is a huge barrier to people actually caring about what we're seeing. And then we fought with the Department of Labor about giving us better information when they said that that's a point in time. That's not the experience. Well, we need to know what's happening so that we can pull women out of poverty, pull their kids out of poverty, and not get them into a tailspin for a decade because of this, economic downturn. And we have such a hard time being able to do that unless we're having an honest conversation about what we're seeing and who's most impacted and who's left behind. And we're not in many ways willing to do that in the policy realm enough.
Can I just follow that up? Yeah, I think what you said, Keisha, is really critical as a former history teacher. I also think we have to rethink the citizen legislature as a thing, because the reality is that ordinary citizens cannot serve in the legislature without tremendous hardship, because it is part-time, because we're paid a little more than $18 an hour while we're in session, because there's no health insurance, because people with young children have a very difficult time balancing the work of the legislature and the schedule of the legislature with their family responsibilities. All of these things make it difficult to shape policy that is informed by the perspective of people with lived experience across the board, that can make a difference in what comes out each session. And unless we're willing to recognize that reality and why there are so many older people in the legislature and people who are retired or independently wealthy, I think we will really struggle to enact the kind of legislation that Keisha is talking about, that Judy's talking about, and that I talked about. So there's some structural change that I think needs to occur. And we're I don't know, real affection for the notion of a citizen legislature. And I think we need to face those facts as well.
If I could just add, you know, we're talking, I think, to a medical community, medical and healthcare policy community. We just had a very painful experience last week in Vermont where, because of an earlier process in the pandemic to try and recognize that BIPOC Vermonters were simply a higher risk category for infection and for you know, adverse health impacts from the pandemic and COVID-19, BIPOC Vermonters were able to be put on a separate list for, you know, for future registration for pandemic related measures. What happened most recently is when they went to register their kids and themselves for booster shots through the Department of Health, there was a 2-day glitch that if you were a BIPOC Vermonter, you had to wait 2 extra days. I mean, I'm not a parent, but I know a lot of parents who were counting down the hours and the minutes to be able to register their child. They might have a pre-existing health issue that made it really important that they access the portal for booster shots. And in all of that, every time you hear, you know, you're BIPOC, so a mistake happened, you're gonna have to wait. We lose people who already have generations of mistrust with the healthcare system. You know, while it was a glitch, people went on, you know, forums to say a glitch means that you didn't test for that possible scenario. It means that you didn't say, how is this experience going to happen for people who registered as BIPOC Vermonters? And so what you're still saying is it was a mistake, but one that we could have found if we had paid attention to the experience of this population. And that is frustrating. That happened this past week after the Department of Health said, we know that so much of these disparities have to do with systemic racism and the voices of people of color and people from marginalized communities being left out of the conversation. And then that happened this past week. And so, you know, we just have so much work to do to repair the harm. And often, you know, what we think of as common mistakes make it quite a bit worse.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. One of the things I mentioned was language within the agencies. A lot of the policies and procedures that they follow were created way back in the 20s and 30s, and they come from rural Vermont, a plan for the future, which was a program and a book written by the Vermont Eugenics Survey and 200 people that helped them. And I think it has to go really deep. I think we have to consider revamping our language and the philosophies in which we use if we're going to make any changes at all. I'm just thinking in my mind what happened last week at our meeting. There was one particular recommendation that we were suggesting language be looked at, and I suggested a diverse institutions of higher education be used rather than just UVM. And they said, well, we have to use UVM by law under the Hatch Act. It has to go to a land grant college. I don't know whether that's true or not, but they wouldn't let the recommendation go through to have specific, not have a specific college addressing this, to have multiple colleges and diverse opinions. They wouldn't let that recommendation go through, which again keeps the philosophy and the language the same. So it's very deep. We have to go very deep to make changes if it's going to have an impact. Charlene, I can't hear you.
My apologies. Our time is almost up. And so what I'd like to do is ask each of you to give us one thought that you'd like to leave Vermonters and others with about eugenics, or how to move beyond eugenics and even beyond apologies. What's one thought you might have? Anyone can start.
I would like to see Vermont move forward in a good way.
Thank you.
I guess I think, well, first, I really want to thank Judy and Keisha and you, Charlene, I'm sorry, for having stuck with this work for years and not growing weary of having to say the same things over and over. And I think that, the thing that kept coming back to me as I was preparing for this is, I think we have to assume always that we're missing voices, that we have not asked all the questions we need to ask. And that is something that we need to keep front of mind as we are considering any range of things, public policy, the policies that we enact in our place of business, the conversations that we have with people. So.
Thank you.
So I just think, something that I think has been a lesson from Judy, particularly, and others, is that if we are not looking 7 generations back and learning lessons about how that's impacted where we are today, and we're not looking 7 generations forward and developing a practice of thinking about the possible impacts of our actions, we're missing a lot of perspective. And we often listen least, whether it's in healthcare or policy or society in general, we often listen least to our youngest and our oldest people, community members. We often brush aside their experiences, their wisdom, their observations, their questions. And I think we do that to our detriment. I think even the act of the practice of slowing down and listening to people whose voices are less heard is, a very helpful way to get information that we're missing otherwise.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for this wisdom you've given us. So you've given us a lot to think about, and I think really to facilitate future critical conversations about eugenics in Vermont and elsewhere. Senator Keisha Roms-Hinsdale, House Representative Tiffany Blumley, Judy Dow, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for listening and being a part of that Vermont story. We'll move right along here now. Our next presenter, Ann Hendrickson, she has, I think, the best title of a session here, White Fright, Eugenics Meets Population Decline and Climate Change. Ann is the director of a challenging population control project, which is part now, I believe, of Collective Power for Reproductive Justice. Some of you may have known of her project in the past called PopDev, but renamed and reconnected. And Ann has been a part of teaching us about population control for a very long time and the connections to eugenics. So we turn it over to her now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Charlene. I'm very pleased to be a part of this anti-eugenics conversation. Last summer, the US Census was released. It showed that the white population in the US is in decline, or more accurately, never was as white as previous census categories suggested. This is true even though it systematically undercounted BIPOC. The census results fueled existing white fright about white population decline. It furthered open support for eugenic great replacement theory. This conspiracy theory claims that waves of Black and brown immigrants and falling white fertility rates in the US and Europe are an existential threat to whiteness. Republican lawmakers, conservative news pundits, and white supremacist groups go so far as to suggest that the Great Replacement is a Democratic Party strategy to replace white, quote unquote, real Americans with left-leaning Black and brown immigrant voters. The theory gained traction in the Trump years, even before the census, and found its way into white supremacist advocacy in New England. For example, in 2018, former Maine Senator Eric Blakey tweeted memes that claimed Senator Angus King aimed to, quote unquote, repopulate Maine with Latinx immigrants. The meme superimposed King's face over a crowd of Central Americans reportedly on their way to the US southern border. Kyle Fitzsimmons brought the conspiracy to Maine lawmakers. Fitzsimmons is the first Maine resident charged with participating in the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol. Before storming the Capitol, he spoke at a 2018 legislative hearing against a bill to support job training in Lewiston for the city's largest immigrant population, many of whom are from Somalia. Fitzsimmons reportedly ranted that Mainers are being replaced by the quote unquote third world, while the opioid crisis is, quote, killing us all, killing off Yankee New England culture, end quote. Both Blakey and Fitzsimmons are from out of state, Ohio and New York, New Jersey, respectively, but project and protect Yankee spirit because they are white. The US is not alone in this white fright. The Great Replacement theory is from a French nationalist, and it has resonated through fascist, white supremacist, and anti-Muslim propaganda worldwide for over a decade. The rhetoric has propelled fascist violence, including the Christchurch, New Zealand, and El Paso, Texas mass shootings. The shooters in each case profess to protect the purity of white, supposedly white nations against infringing overpopulation. But they also claim to defend the purity of nature, particularly in this time of climate change. Eco-fascism is on the rise beyond these violent instances. The far right has taken up climate change as a cause, and its environmental advocacy promotes xenophobia and hate. Far right political parties in Europe fight to keep out immigrants in the name of conservation. Such bordering arguments suggest that anti-immigrant borders are a tool for environmental protection against climate refugees and others. US conservatives apply eco-fascist arguments to border politics. The Arizona Attorney General, Mark Brnovich, is suing the Biden administration for failing to uphold Trump-era immigration restrictions, including construction of the border wall, on the grounds that this will encourage migrants who will degrade the environment. Brnovich asserts that this violates the US National Environmental Protection Act because, quote, as more and more people come into the country, it has a more and more devastating impact on our environment, end quote. In a similar vein, white supremacist Richard Spencer cited protection of nature as one of the reasons white supremacists need to grab power in his statement that incited the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. These fascist arguments parallel more mainstream population and environmental politics, with similar racialized overtones about whiteness and national belonging. These often pit a graying white global north in decline against a youthful, growing, and encroaching Black and brown South. For instance, French President Macron has warned of, quote, Africa's demographic time bomb, unquote, and its dangerous pressure on Europe. Prominent environmentalists share fears of this so-called population bomb and promote population reduction, particularly in African countries, as a solution to climate change and other environmental problems. This is despite evidence that 12% of the population in rich countries, like the US, is responsible for the majority of historic and current CO2 emissions. As fertility rates have dropped in the US, emission rates have risen. Climate change is not driven by population growth, nor will reducing the number of future births address the current crisis. Nonetheless, at COP26, a UK environmental group called Population Matters inflated a 23-foot inflatable baby with a bib that read "Smaller families, cooler planet." This bit of political theater ultimately reinforces the idea that the environment is in danger from Black and brown population growth. Even though the terrifyingly large baby is white with big blue eyes, the group Population Matters aims to target those in high fertility areas like African countries to save the planet, not the populations in graying countries. White fright about population and environment resonates on both left and right. It is contributing to heightened borders, geopolitical divides, and the scapegoating of Black and brown people for environmental problems. So how can these eugenic fears be challenged in New England for an anti-eugenic future? And I'd like to offer just a few thoughts and invite continued conversation. The first is recognize racialized eugenic thinking in calls to preserve so-called Yankee culture and landscapes as New England ages and climate change alters the environment. 2, expect that far-right activism and politics in New England states will continue and connect with fascist white supremacist conspiracies more broadly. Given the current GOP rhetoric, it could become more violent, unfortunately. And finally, advocate for a broader and welcoming definition of who belongs in New England. Openly challenge anti-immigrant and racist sentiments in the region, including the entrenched notion that you need to trace your pedigree back several generations to truly belong. And I will end there. I look forward to a continued conversation, and you're always welcome to contact me. Thank you.
Great. Anne, thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking us a step deeper in terms of roots of racialization and naming white supremacy. It's really important. Thank you. And we're going to continue some of these same topics into our next panel. And again, I'm going to turn that back to Natalie Koeffler. Panel is entitled Humans, Nature, and Eugenics. So we've got a thread going here. So take it from there, Natalie.
Thank you, Charlene, and thank you, Anne, as well. I think this does flow really, really well and gets us into sort of unpacking the ideas of eugenics, as Judy has also brought up, and how they expand beyond the non-human, and more specifically, how they expand to just who belongs in nature and in spaces of decision-making around the environment. I'd like to introduce a woman who I work really closely with. We co-instruct several classes together at Harvard. I have learned so much from her, and you will, I'm sure, over the next panel, Riley Tettenfong. She's at UC San Diego. She's an expert in Indigenous sovereignty, as well as community engagement. And let me tell you, she does not shy away from those difficult conversations, but does so with a immense amount of grace and humility and kindness. And I think we all have a lot to learn from her. So Riley, I'm going to pass it to you to kind of introduce our panel, and she will kick us off with the presentation.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And thanks to the Hutchins Center for organizing, and to all of the wonderful panelists that we've heard from so far. Let me quickly get my screen going for you. All righty. Let me know if you can see that okay. So hello, everyone. As Natalie said, my name is Riley Tettenfong. I am joining you today from San Diego, California, where my home and my home institution of UC San Diego sit on the unceded territories of the Kumeyaay Nation. And to situate myself just a bit further for you, I myself am Chamorro on my father's side. That means I descend from the indigenous peoples of Guahan, the island of Guam and the Marianas Islands. And I descend from Europeans on my mother's side. So these are some of the kind of perspectives and investments I bring to the work that I do. And so I am currently a postdoc here at UC San Diego in the School of Public Health. And as Natalie mentioned, I also have the great honor and privilege of co-teaching with her for Harvard's Scientific Citizenship Initiative and the Master of Bioethics program. And so I'm really excited to just join such an esteemed group of speakers in this event and specifically on this panel today, several of whom are students from one of Natalie and my environmental bioethics course that we taught last J term at Harvard. And so in this panel, we're going to tie the focus on eugenic futures to environmental considerations. And to start us off, I want to take a few minutes to just ground our discussion in some reflection on the fundamental role that the structure of settler colonialism has played in histories of eugenics. And in doing so, just offer that a future that is anti-eugenic must necessarily dismantle the structures of colonialism that degrade the environment and also degrade human relations to the environment, as several of our speakers have already touched upon in earlier panels today. And so as you'll have learned throughout several sessions of this conference, in the United States, eugenics is deeply entangled with colonial projects, including those carried out under the rubric of environmental conservation. And so when we look to the narratives mobilized to justify the dispossession of indigenous peoples from their lands, to make way for settler claims to land as property, we really begin to see their resonances with eugenic logics, right? So for one, metaphors of purity have always done powerful cultural work, including eugenic projects equating whiteness to so-called racial purity, and settler approaches to environmentalism that fix an image of nature as pure, pristine, untouched wilderness. And Anne Hendrickson just touched a bit on this in the last session. And so this image of pristine wilderness is one, driving myth of settler colonial claims to land, right? So one layer of this being that before settlement, land was simply empty or not being used, ideologies of terra nullius, right, that get codified into policy. And this idea that there was simply no one there, sort of making the land more amenable to the taking and management by settlers. And so, of course, we know this is not true. Native peoples have been here for millennia, are still here. And so to make an untouched wilderness was to remove indigenous peoples with millennia-long relations to their ancestral lands and ecologies. And this, of course, is the story of the establishment of many national parks on the North American continent, right? The forcible removal of indigenous peoples who have long called those places home and calling that conservation. And as Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powis-White has described, settler colonialism is a form of domination that violently disrupts human relationships with the environment. And so the graphic here shows the seizure of native land on Turtle Island or the continental US between 1776 and 1887. So blue being native homelands and the red showing the establishment of reservations. And right, so I show this because this is I think a powerful depiction of the dispossession that encompasses settler colonialism. And this also indicates a major shift in environmental stewardship that has had lasting and perilous effects for those indigenous peoples whose lifeways have been disrupted through this displacement, and consequently for our shared environment at large. Right, and so as Judy Dow really cogently described earlier on her panel, these colonial and eugenic ideologies, ultimately threaten broader human relations to land, right? Given the logics they embed about how we ought to relate to, or rather use, nature, right? And so this is evident in California, where we've seen, really massive wildfires recently. California recorded its first gigafire in modern history with the August complex fire back in August 2020. A gigafire, that is a fire that burns at least 1 million acres. And so California Native peoples have always known that fires are, an important part of California's landscape and have stewarded particular sets of knowledge and ceremonies and practices to manage it, right? So historically, they've held cultural burns to clear underbrush, to encourage new plant growth, to manage wildfires, until these practices were really disrupted under Western colonization via cultural suppression and even policies explicitly aimed at prohibiting cultural burning practices. And so only recently have we really seen this wider recognition that Western approaches to management, including fire suppression, have actually exacerbated California's wildfire risk. And so only recently have state officials then begun partnering with tribal leaders in hopes of restoring some of those cultural burning practices. Right. And so I'm going to begin to close here with this example, and just to say that when we think about legacies of eugenics and what those really mean for the future of our environment, we have much to learn, much to repair from histories in which Indigenous stewardship practices have really been disrupted, and should all have a really deep investment in seeing how we can restore those relations. And so I'm going to begin to transition here and pass it to the rest of our wonderful panelists who have much more to offer in thinking through histories and futures of eugenics in relation to the environment. And so our next speaker is going to be Tallulah Keeley-LeClaire. Tallulah is a senior at Yale studying ethnic studies and urban studies, and you may have seen them sharing the really important archival work they've done around eugenics at Yale in earlier sessions of this event. So I'll go ahead and pass it to you, Tallulah, and invite you to further introduce yourself as well.
Thank you so much, Riley. Yeah, as you mentioned, I am a senior at Yale. I've been working since the beginning of the summer doing archival work about the history of eugenics at Yale. And today I'll be talking a little bit more about what my thesis is actually on, which is this overlap between environmentalism, eugenics, and Yale's history. So in this presentation, I'll be using Gifford Pinchot, who's pictured here, as kind of a main way to talk through the relationship between Yale's forestry school and eugenics. So he founded the forestry school in 1900 with a gift from his family, and at the time, he was serving as the chief of the Division of Forestry, and he actually appointed his assistant from the division, Henry Graves, to be the first director of the new school. And both of them were Yale alums, so it was very much an internal affair in a way. And his desire to found the forestry school was partially born out of his successes in his career. So in the first 5 years of his appointment, the division was upgraded to bureau status and saw the creation of the national forests, which, as Riley kind of started to get into, is like a very problematized notion of the wilderness. And these kind of expansions really added to the responsibility of Pinchot and his team. And so his formation of the forestry school was a way to fill his manpower needs, and also gave him even greater control over the production of new leaders for both the Forest Service and also like the forestry profession as a whole. So as I mentioned, Pinchot was responsible for really revolutionizing how the US Forest Service worked, and he helped establish it as a legitimate and rigorous government department. But that was just his own power. The forestry school also held a very powerful and privileged position. So it operated almost exactly as how he envisioned. And the three following chiefs of the Forest Service after Pinchot's successor, who was Henry Graves, were all graduates from the forest school. And additionally, the forestry school at Yale is the oldest forestry school in the United States. And since its inception, there was an undergraduate program at Cornell and a non-university one-year program at the Biltmore Forest that were both established in 1898, but both of those programs ceased to exist by 1910, whereas Yale's influence and power through the forestry school continued to grow and maintains a lot of prominence today. So Pinchot was also notably a very close friend of President Theodore Roosevelt, so we have this image of them together on the left. And during his administration, as I think is pretty commonly known about Roosevelt, one thing that's emphasized is his interest in conservation. And because they were such close friends, Pinchot often advised the president on matters related to the subject. But this was actually not the only area of interest that the two had in common. And Roosevelt also shared this concern over race suicide and was interested in maintaining the purity of this white, most fit class of Americans. And as Judy Dow actually spoke very brilliantly about in the earlier panel, like this link between conservation and eugenics can't be overlooked. And so I have a couple examples to share today from the archives to help illustrate this connection, and I'll largely let them speak for themselves and as a way to kind of illustrate the perspective of Pinchot and other conservationists at this kind of foundational moment for American environmentalism as we continue to know it today. So the first is this 1909 address that Pinchot gave at the First National Conservation Congress. And in it, he emphasizes that conservation arises out of common sense and for the common good. And he also claims that the outcome of conservation will be increased national efficiency. And again, as Riley kind of set up, what's really lacking from this is kind of who is this common good and common sense, and what efficiency is he really talking about? So the next piece I want to share is from the First National Conference on Race Betterment, which was hosted in 1914. And Pinchot was a member of the Central Committee, and he helped organize the event. So the two stated aims of this conference were about establishing evidence of racial degeneration in America, and then to promote methods of bettering the racial status. So here again, we see Pinchot and his circle of peers invested in a type of conservation. But again, this time it's not of the environment, it's of racialized subjects. So then finally, I have this excerpt from Tomorrow's Children, which was written in 1935 by Ellsworth Huntington in conjunction with the directors of the AES. And Pinchot was not among the board of directors at the time, but he was on the advisory committee, and so he would have been aware, certainly, of what was being published. So Huntington, in speaking about the management of the birth rate in the US, argues that eugenics will make education, government, religion, science, and business all more effective and efficient, which is very similar to Pinchot's earlier argument about conservation promoting a national efficiency. And Huntington also emphasizes multiple times in the book that the goal of eugenics is to improve life for everyone, which is a very fraught concept as he's using it. And obviously, as we've kind of continued to talk about throughout this series, this everyone and mankind as a whole is not exemplative of the actual full population. So these examples are just a way for us to begin thinking through this relationship between conservation, eugenics, and institutions like the Yale Forestry School, which is actually now called the Yale School of the Environment, but it's no less prominent than in its first few decades of founding. So in 2017, the school actually unveiled a new strategic plan, which calls for the development of new curricula and increased programs and hiring to address environmental equity and diversity issues. So as we think towards the future, we really need to push at these types of initiatives and ask what they're doing to change the field, and how do they understand this history of environmentalism and conservation, which from its very formal inception shared this worldview that was not only compatible with eugenics, but was a continuation of these earlier logics, such as Riley kind of helped us begin to think about. So thank you so much. And with that, I will pass it back to Natalie, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tallulah and Riley. Wonderful, just building of awareness for us. I really appreciate that. I'm just going to screen share quickly. Let's see. And so, I think what really comes up with what Riley and Tallulah have just introduced for us is how American environmental conservation and just our general ideas about the human relationship with nature and how to be conserving nature really comes down to these questions of who belongs, right? Who belongs in nature and who belongs in society. And so I wanted to first start with a reading that I normally read as well in our environmental ethics class. It's just an excerpt from this really fantastic piece of work by Carolyn Finney Black faces, white spaces. There's a saying that nature always finds a way, that despite human beings' best efforts to keep certain processes and phenomena separate, controlled, and managed, the messiness of life reminds us that we are simply part of a larger system. There is a little known incident that took place in 1960, which I believe illustrates the danger inherent in keeping the subjects of these two documents separate. A white professor of theology from Boston University was planning an upcoming vacation at a national park in Canada for himself, his wife, and an African-American couple who were good friends. Dr. DeWolf wrote the owner of the Fundy Park Chalets in New Brunswick to eliminate any embarrassment that might befall his African-American friends when they all showed up at the park. In his letter, Dr. DeWolf stated that he was confident that his friends would be treated well, but he just wanted to be sure. Dr. DeWolf described the husband as university trained with 4 degrees, an author, and underscored that both the husband and wife were highly cultured people of superior character. Dr. DeWolf did not get a response right away, and when he did, it was not the answer he hoped for. The owner of the chalets stated that because they get many American guests at their site, he could not accept the possibility of embarrassment which may arise from this situation. The irony of this story is that the African-American couple that was refused a reservation at the Fundy Park Chalet in Fundy National Park was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, Coretta Scott King. Dr. King was simply exhausted from his civil rights work and wanted the chance to renew his spirit and focus on his writing. No doubt, Sassiner, Leopold, Brown, and Muir would have understood Dr. King's impulse to choose a national park, a wilderness setting, to find that renewal, inspiration, and peace. But not even someone as distinguished as Dr. King, arguably the most visible icon of the civil rights movement, could escape the vagaries of that time, even by crossing the border. So I think what this story tells clear, again, is this question, of who belongs. And that really the establishment of the national park systems within the United States and within Canada as well, has been working just as it meant to. It was envisioned by Pinchot and Roosevelt and their buddies, really to be a place where only the able-bodied, the rich, the white men were meant to enjoy nature. That was their God-given right to access the divine in nature. And we see it today. Everybody knows this. We see it when Black bird watchers like Christian Cooper have the cops called on them in Central Park. We see it in Dorchetta Taylor's report on diversity environmental organizations, which showed that 88% of leadership is white and 84% of staff are white. We see it in the placement of polluting factories, Amazon distribution centers, and waste management plants, all built in neighborhoods of color. I can tell you, it is going exactly to plan. And it doesn't just get limited to humans. These ideals of eugenics around purity, of control, of hierarchy and superiority, we see it very much in the descriptions of the non-human as well. I'm going to read, this is a little excerpt from a piece by Banu Subramaniam, and she has a fantastic book called Ghost Stories of Darwin, but she also has a publication called The Aliens Have Landed. And as you look through this list of headlines, you see words like aliens, native species invaded, bioinvasion spark concern, biological invaders threaten US ecology. And as she writes in her piece, exotic plants, they argue, are irreversibly altering waterways and farmlands. The irreversibility is highlighted as a way to stress the sharp departure from the past, a vision of how we are moving from a peaceful, co-evolved nature in perfect harmony and balance to an uncertain future with alien and exotic plants and animals. They argue that we cannot recapture the glorious past of our nostalgia for a pure and uncontaminated nature and harmony and balance if we do not act now to stem the tide of outsiders. To me, this is eugenics in a nutshell, and it's going strong and powerfully in the environmental conservation space. One place we see it as well is in the hierarchy and categorization of species. We see this as a way that we see some species as less than others. We see it in the need to protect species over the rights of an individual animal or plant. Or we see it in the need to protect biodiversity, even at the expense of certain species. This is from a video from BBC. It's being taken in the Galapagos Island, where they have a really large issue with what they call, an invasive goat population. These are military snipers shooting goats from a helicopter. We see it when we see rodenticides dumped from planes to kill, in very horrible ways, invasive rats on certain islands. We see it when toads are being run over in Australia, or where children are engaged in competition in New Zealand to kill as many hedgehogs as they can. This othering, this idea of exotic and invasiveness, can allow for the dehumanization, in a way, of these certain species to allow incredible atrocities to occur. And it also happens when we're trying to conserve and protect the purity of a species. These are pregnant bighorn ram female rams being transported by helicopter for miles to being reintroduced in new areas. It's when we see the few remaining individuals of a species collected in nature and put in zoos for breeding programs. And it doesn't mean that these aren't important things to do, to protect, the future of certain species, but how are we treating these individuals? And I think we can do better. And then we come to today, where we are faced with a variety of different tools, specifically those of the genetic nature, allowing us to tinker and alter genomes to either protect, bring back, or suppress certain species. We have George Church and billionaires funding his work, wanting to bring back the woolly mammoth. We have ideas of genetically engineering mosquitoes to suppress their populations in Hawaii and protect certain honeycreeper birds that are under peril of extinction. We have the same ideas of eliminating certain rodents on islands using genetics. And I think so. The point here is that we are at a new sort of frontier, many of the same conversations, but different. And what do they look like as we move forward? So with that, I want to introduce 4 of our students from our environmental ethics class that Riley and I teach in the January term at Harvard. And they are going to be sharing with you an environmental ethic that they and their classmates have created that can help to address these really complicated environmental decisions, and which really put history and environmental justice and social justice at its center. So the 4 students I will be introducing, are former students, many of them as well, is first Izzy Hernandez. She has graduated from the Masters of Bioethics program at Harvard and is now a law student at the University of Pennsylvania. She will be followed by Emily Cecilio, who was both a Master's of Bioethics student and a Master's of Public Health student, and also the Associate Director of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, where she runs community engagement for that organization, as well as Isabel Picardo, who is a patient liaison and advocate at Mass General Hospital and one of our former environmental ethics students. And lastly, Shika Kalavor, who is currently a bioethics fellow at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City. And Shika is also a nurse. Izzy, I will pass it to you to kick us off. And I believe you'd like me to screen share as well, correct? 1 second.
Hi, everyone. I'm Izzy, and I'm just going to get us started by talking a little bit about what the environmental ethic we envision to be is. So let's start, with the problem, which is the fact that We as humans have been and continue to destroy the earth and those who live here, those who we deem inferior. We just eliminate, as you know, this entire talk is about eugenics. And so the only way to kind of reverse course and like potentially postpone ecological collapse is if we act now and change the way we think about things. But the problem is that environmental decision-making processes are exclusionary and they leave out those most impacted by and least responsible for climate change. And so those with environmental decision-making power, which is, you know, historically white men, as Tallulah and Natalie have already spoken to, they keep themselves in charge and they preserve these power imbalances that contribute to environmental degradation. So after saying all that, that is who we are not. We're an interdisciplinary group of students of different races, genders, ethnicities, abilities, and lived experiences. And we initially met through the bioethics course that Natalie and Riley teach on environmental ethics and justice. And while we are all those amazing things, we acknowledge that we're only human, and so we can't speak for the non-human realm. But together we learned that it is the divergent experiences that we have that is our strength and not our weakness. It is the lens through which we understand environmental justice, and it is this voice that we bring to classical environmental ethics conversations. And so with our collective voice, we call on all people, all individuals with environmental decision-making power to follow this new environmental ethical framework that centers 4 principles: participatory justice, reciprocity, responsibility, and intergenerational justice. These 4 principles, we believe, provide an action guiding framework for realizing equity in environmental decisions and in policy. What's so different about it, you know, compared to those of the past, is that it prioritizes the needs of communities marginalized by institutions and most harmed by environmental decisions. It refocuses on generations of indigenous knowledge that tell us that humans are kin to non-humans in the land. We're not separate from them. It holds individuals, institutions, and governments accountable. It provides reparations for historical injustices, and it recognizes a duty to future generations. So that's what we're like, you know, hoping to bring to the table. And I think that it's possible if people are willing to change how they view environmental ethics. So I'm going to pass it along to the next person.
Thanks, Izzy. The first part of our environmental ethic is participatory justice, which is foundational to preventing eugenic trajectories in environmental decision-making. Participatory justice broadly means the participation and leadership of individuals and communities most directly impacted by outcomes from the decision-making process. We believe participatory justice centers 4 items. 1, it requires that those with influence and power give up power to those most impacted. We suggest going further than simple inclusivity, which can be really tokenistic, to instead have deliberations led by those most tangibly impacted and ancestrally related to the environment we're talking about. Second, not expecting individuals to always speak on behalf of entire communities. This requires intentional effort to achieve representativeness and participation and diversity of perspective, even within impacted communities, and this process should ideally be led by those communities. Third, valuing forms of knowledge that are not traditionally valued in the exclusionary institutions often making decisions. Exclusionary institutions have defined expertise in a limited way, drawing from peer-reviewed scientific literature and capitalist enterprise, as Dr. Fox and Judy Dow both mentioned, for centuries. We believe experiential and ancestral knowledge offers much to a system that is harmful in its current knowledge value structures and is missing from most environmental decision-making in a meaningful way. And the fourth part of this, recognizing those voices that are not in the physical and in the present. Participatory justice considers moving away from an anthropocentric view and includes non-humans at the table. This also includes future generations of both humans and non-humans. And just a quick illustration, again, using Vermont as a smaller scale example, there's some news and political activity around the demolition of a nuclear power plant along the Connecticut River and what the acceptable residual radiation dose ought to be for the cleanup. This decision should not be made by the contracted demolition company, but ought to be led by diverse voices from the local Abenaki community who have a deep connection with the river and a historical home on the land, as well as local non-native residents. Also, representative placeholders for the Connecticut River, the ecosystems it houses, and future generations of diverse Vermonters ought to have a seat at the table. Finally, participatory justice in this cleanup decision, of course, does not adequately reckon with or repair the fact that community participation was not pursued in the decision to put the power plant there in the first place decades ago, or the forced removal of Abenaki people from that location over centuries prior. Shika will get into that, but for now, I will pass it on to Asaba.
Thank you so much, Emily and Izzy, for the introduction. When talking about reciprocity, it's about exchanging the benefits, but also sacrifices and responsibilities when advocating for a particular environmental action, one that perhaps can help us reduce a carbon footprint to tackle global warming, or take positive steps to protect a native animal species in danger of extinction, including our own. Earth is the environment that continues to ensure our survival. So our principle of reciprocity demands to view non-human species as having intrinsic value as well. This approach requires respect that must be included in our actions and policies. We in the field of ethics, indigenous practices, empathy, gratitude, respect, and responsibility for the appropriate use of land and natural resources are vital to maintain that biodiversity and as means of recognizing interdependence between human and non-human beings. That being said, if we continue to see Earth as a gift, we should also think of what we should give in return. If we see it instead as a mother, then it deserves personhood, rights, and systemic protections that recognize the planet as a family member. Language plays a critical role in how we define those things, especially when developing policies that can dramatically impact Earth's sustainability. But this practice of humility and respect towards the planet is not a new idea, however. Several indigenous groups, such as the Inca, Taínos, and many other tribes from the Native American communities, share the universal sentiment. We must take care of the planet that looks after us. The spiritual and logistical connection these communities have shared with Earth for centuries have allowed the cultivation of knowledge and wisdom that has been translated into sustainable agriculture, hunting, and fishing, which our capitalist economies have historically damaged. In places like Brazil, Puerto Rico, and the US, indigenous leaders are demanding local and global governments for stronger rights in efforts to protect their ecosystems. We need environmental ethics that recognizes the value and the knowledge on how to take care of the land. That's why more than ever, this initiative can teach us how to be more responsible of our conservation. A step forward, justice, and humility that forces us to take a step away from sole human interest and exploitative attitudes. That's what we think we owe to Earth and that we owe to each other and the future. And with that being said, I'll pass it to Shika. Thank you.
I'm going to go first, so I'm going to talk a little bit about responsibility as an important tenet of our ethic. So once we've established like who ought to participate in the process and what we owe to one another when making environmentally ethical decisions, we must ask how we can hold ourselves accountable to the tenets of this ethic. So environmental ethics as a discipline tends to be a little bit divided on the value of non-humans. So whether we think they have intrinsic value or not. But there's generally a consensus about the importance of responsible actions, whatever that may mean. You know, often that's something that's pretty elusive and people haven't defined. But to be responsible, we think you need to be sufficiently self-aware that we as humans are the problem. Like, just, we got to get that straight, and then we can move from there. And while we all play a role in the world's possible demise, our responsibilities vary given our differing positions of privilege and power. So like Western nations and white people share a greater proportion of the responsibility for environmental destruction, while others, such as indigenous peoples and small island nations, who are most vulnerable to climate change, have often the least to do with that exacerbation. So if we want to prevent further devastation, those of us in power must, I'm saying myself as though like I have that much power, but you know what I mean. We must reflect on the ways humans and non-humans are neglected in decisions about the environment. That's our responsibility. So to act responsibly, victims of environmental destruction, usually marginalized groups and non-humans, need to have a deliberately elevated role in decision-making processes. We can no longer have individuals and non-humans who've been sidelined historically continue to be sidelined if we want there to be a difference in the future. Clearly, we've had sufficient time to be in charge and we haven't done a great job. So we need to allow those who actually understand what needs to happen to take the reins. So this actually requires a high level of environmental integrity from individuals and institutions, which requires them to give up some of their power, which is probably going to be incredibly difficult, but needs to happen, because individualism alone will not save us. We need institutional change, which can only occur if those in power within these institutions, such as Yale and Harvard, act responsibly. With that said, I'm going to pass it over to Shika.
Thank you so much, everyone. So our last and fourth ethic focuses on intergenerational justice. And the emphasis of this ethic is to focus on the connectedness of the past, the present, and the future. And we recognize that a just future requires reckoning with past and present harms, particularly to communities of color, and knowing that our actions now will affect future generations. That being said, we hope to shape the future, but also recognize our obligations to repair the past at the same time. We also emphasize that we cannot be successful if we only respond to a single element, past, present, or future, and that we must consider history, as well as current capabilities, as well as future needs. And just to exemplify this, thinking about the past, we can think about the uranium mines in Navajo nations, which the EPA promised to clean up is still an unfulfilled promise. In the present, we could support existing initiatives, especially led by marginalized communities. And in the future, considering impacts on the non-human world, and this can look like granting personhood to entities like rivers and lakes to ensure that they still exist for generations to come. And with this ethic, we hope to introduce a different way of doing things because the old ways do not work. You could redefine expertise. So decision-making power shouldn't solely lie in corporations, in labs and in universities, that we must empower communities that are most affected and step away from those who have historically held power. We're in a serious moment right now. With this ethic, we took a look at Biden's new clean energy revolution with a lens of these 4 components that we've outlined in our paper so that we can bring these things to fruition responsibly. And so I ask everyone listening today, what do you want the world to look like where we can ensure a future where every being can flourish, because we cannot afford to continue on the same path that we are on now. And so with all of that being said, I just want to say thank you to everyone here. Thank you to Riley and Natalie for guiding us and teaching us. And hopefully this has been effective. If anyone else has anything to add, feel free.
Thank you. I have nothing more to add. And I'm sure Riley will share with me. And just like, I'm literally almost in tears with pride. So just thank you. These are the voices we need to be listening to. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to showcase the really hard work that the 4 of you and your classmates have done. So with that, we will close our panel on the environment. I know we are way behind schedule, and I I will now pass it over to Daniel Hosing and Milton Reynolds, who will be hosting a conversation about eugenics in education.
Great. Thanks so much, Natalie. Thanks for the really, really wonderful panel. We have about 25 minutes left to just this fantastic day. I have the enormous privilege of spending just about 10, maybe a little more minutes with our next guest, Milton Reynolds, who I'll introduce quickly, to talk about the task of education, of public education, really orienting us to this charge about the future, what the future holds and what we can do about it. And then we'll have a chance to bring everyone back for some very quick closing comments. And we're so grateful for everyone for spending this time with us, both at today's session and these the last two really fantastic sessions. So quickly, Milton, my good friend and colleague, Milton Reynolds, is a San Francisco-based, Bay Area-based educator, author, equity and inclusion consultant, and longtime organizer and activist. A wide body of work related to teacher education, focusing on law enforcement reform, juvenile justice, education transformation, disability, and always someone so thoughtful. So Milton, I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you. And I want to just jump right in to make best use of our time. So Milton, you've had a long body of work as a teacher educator, working with teachers on how these histories of eugenics are taught, giving them the skills to do it. And I just thought, since we haven't had as much chance to talk about education, to say a little bit about what that work looks like in the classroom and why it's important to engage classroom teachers in these histories.
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the question as well. I mean, the work in education can look different in different contexts, but if I was to distill it down, the goal is to really help educators understand that they're actually participating in one of the primary sites of racialization, which is our school system. And when I say racialization, I mean a system that assigns value and meaning to students in categorical ways that imposes a differential value, in which a lot of preoccupation is put upon measuring and ranking, and then allocating resources and opportunities accordingly. The challenge is that the notions around which they do that ranking and ordering of value are rooted in these eugenic fallacies, right? And so disrupting education as a side of racialization is critical, because it's not just a place where we create our future by allocating opportunities for advancement, but it's also where these notions, these essentialist notions, get inculcated. And so I think stepping back and actually reckoning with the weight of that is really critical in this moment, because too often there's a desire to move quickly. And when we move quickly, we can't attend to the enormity of these issues because they're complex and they're deeply rooted. But what I'll say shortly is also that much of that work is really working with engaging teachers around their practice, and particularly in shared meaning making, because the reality is we're always going to be smarter as a collective. And that's the unfortunate reality that eugenics obscures. It opposes a differential value when no such thing exists.
Milton, that's so helpful. That differential value, measuring and ranking, those are so core to how we often think about education. We've heard all throughout the session about how central they are to a kind of eugenicist vision of the world. And I just want to highlight, I mean, all of us in this meeting and at our institutions are in communities where public education is central. It's essential to our future, and what an important site this is. Can you talk about some of the opportunities you see moving forward to really bringing out so many of the dynamic ideas that we've had a chance to think about in this meeting today and across the project, and how they might help to shape the kinds of education we might build for ourselves in the future?
So if we think about it as a systems issue, I mean, the challenge is moving these ideas across the system in such a way that it permeates the system with some fidelity and continuity. And when I'm talking about moving ideas, the ideas that I'm thinking about are ones that help us confront essentialism, right? And ideas that help us begin to think in integrative or systems way rather than in abstractive and disassociated ways, which I think, again, are the kind of habits of mind that get cultivated. So if I think about it on a macro level, one important side of intervention is teacher education programs. I think it should be mandatory, quite frankly, that all teacher education programs have a unit, and a fairly extensive one, that looks at the role of eugenics on education. And that's everything from testing to assumptions about intellect and ability, how funds and resources are allocated, who we see as disposable, all those kinds of things. That should be part and parcel of everybody's teacher education program. And quite frankly, if we're really serious about that, those conversations need to start long before somebody makes the decision about what they're going to do once they get to college, right? And I would argue that if we actually were teaching this history, that students that are attending universities would look much different, because it would invite them into a conversation that I think many students are longing for. So very specifically, California is moving pretty quickly around ethnic studies. And I think ethnic studies can be a place in which we begin to think about differential or relational racialization but it would require a shift. Oftentimes, ethnic studies programs are rooted in analysis of identity. And what I'm making the argument for is actually looking at patterns of identification, and specifically relational or comparative identification, perhaps more relational. I think that's actually useful. Because if you start to talk about identification or racialization as a project, an ongoing project, you can begin to engage with the power dynamics. And I think too often, conversations that are solely focused on identity accept the essentialist commitments as a given, and they don't oftentimes interrogate the power relationships, which I think is so critical. And that's what's being illuminated by this emerging analysis, in which are actually reclaiming many of the histories from marginalized communities. And it's the conversations that they're pushing and the questions they're asking that are catapulting us into this much more systematic and systemic and structural analysis.
That's great, because Milton, you've just given us, I think, two really, really important things to think about. One is, and we've heard that the term interdependence and relationality all throughout. And really, just to pick up on something, that there's a way of talking about race, even sometimes in ethnic studies projects, that actually reproduces a certain kind of essentialized notion of race being somehow simply situated in the body, and not actually the product of social relations, powers, and histories. So it's a caution about that, right? Actually, in some ways, another ways eugenics logics can linger on, even in work that's oppositional. And second, this tremendous opportunity to take this work and collaborate with colleagues in teacher education programs to ensure that that's a really fundamental part of teacher education and classroom training moving forward. Right before we bring other folks back on, Milton, you've been really connected to the From Small Beginnings project across the country. There's other regions having similar meetings. You just mentioned some work happening in California. Are there other ideas from those sites that you might want us to think about and with that have excited you as we think about what an anti-eugenics future really looks like?
So I think much of what will happen is an ongoing meditation, right? And it's a function of the provocation we've all been invited into by broadening the scope of interrogation into eugenics. Among the things I think have been most exciting and will promise to be more generative in the future are really engaging in a process of shared meaning making where we democratize voices. And in doing so, we're pushing back against the seductive patterning towards the exclusion of certain voices. I'm making the argument that the voices aren't missing, they've been excluded. And so we're engaging in shared meaning making, and we're also engaging in shared meaning making both within and across different national boundaries. Racialization is a context-specific endeavor. And so it's really important to understand that the local context really matters in terms of how we understand it. We should also pay attention to the larger, sort of more universal patterns, but understand that the manifestation and the imposition of hierarchical value is always a local process. And so we want to continue to engage and continue to build the community of conscience, because this is going to be long-term work. These notions are so deeply insinuated into societies that it'll take some time to extricate them. And complexity doesn't yield to simplification, but it does yield to time on task. And so I'm looking forward to building more structures and mechanisms through which we can engage in sustained meaning making, and then move these conversations more broadly to the public, and certainly down to students who have every right to be invited in these conversations, And I think if we invite them into the conversation, we're also inviting them to a much deeper level of critical thinking and moving beyond these sort of performative aspects of education that too oftentimes are stultifying and uninteresting to the vast majority of students.
Thanks, Milton. So I'm hearing, and I'll invite now us, we can bring back the panelists for our just last quick closing comments, but an urge to kind of stay with the complexity, with collaboration, and with real attention to local conditions. I mean, I think as this day is really demonstrated. So Milton, you're gonna stay with us, and I'm hoping you might have, just, perhaps another example from another site to get us to think about those. So I'm gonna welcome everyone back for our last few minutes here. I'll just say something very quickly by way of kind of synthesis, and then have a short question for each of you, and continue to invite folks listening and watching to share any questions using the question and answer feature. We've learned today, certainly, that eugenics is not just a narrow set of practices that somehow magically withered away, in the mid-20th century in the face of claims for rights and justice. In fact, it's a whole ideology, it's a worldview, a way of understanding our relationship to one another, to the ecosystem, to non-human animals, it's everything. And I've also learned today that anti-eugenics is not just the lack of practices associated with eugenics, but its presence. It's what we heard about, the dignity-based traditions and personhood, land as kinship, a different kind of center, diverse ways in which humanity is inhabited and lived and celebrated, the new ethical framework we heard about. But we have this task now in the remaining minutes, which is how do we ensure that that's not just a framework that we kind of cloak ourselves in, feel good about having insights, but actually struggle to move out into the world, to help invite people into it, and to help build the ideas and the people and the collectivities we'll need for those struggles. So I want to just pose a closing question to each, and I'll start, for Charlene and Judy in the kind of for the Vermont project. So the whole process that you described, both the apology, but also the relationships that were forged during that time, how wide-ranging it was, seems really one model of this work. And I'm wondering if you can share both any insights or lessons from others in our region who might want to replicate or draw from or do that. So this is a little bit of a how-to question. And also maybe to say something quick about where you're going next. What does the work look like next? And I'll invite Charlene or Judy, either one of you, to start us off.
Judy, go ahead.
Well, the relationship between myself and Keisha was formed back in the early 2000s when she was a representative and not a senator. And people were going for recognition. At that point, she began to understand the historical trauma, the problems, the history, and all of that. And she later ran to become a senator, and her journey into that story continued. So with Tiff, my relationship is relatively new, but the one thing the two of them have in common is that they're both were extremely willing to learn. So I don't know how this works in other states, but we have a part-time legislative body. They're only in there from January to like May or June, something like that. And then both Keisha and Tiff has taken the summer and the fall to continue to learn. They've come to my classes, they've come to my home, and we've shared documents so they could see the history I was talking about. And I think that willingness to learn is very different than other legislators. And because many of them think they already know it all. They don't have to know, they don't have to learn anything. And I think that's got to be a critical ingredient to move forward.
I think what I'll just add to that is since getting involved in Vermont with this, so back up, I co-taught a course in eugenics where we focused on North Carolina 7 or 8 years ago. Very different context, very different set of people involved. And I think being here now and being in Vermont, the apology route has enabled conversations to start up in every single sector of society. In other words, when you get the politicians involved and you try and do something as simple as an apology, you can get everyone involved. It's an avenue, kind of a nexus point for getting everyone involved. That said, not everyone has been involved yet here. Clearly and thankfully, the legislators saw that an apology is only a first step. And they wrote into the resolutions that they needed to take action beyond just this statement of apology. So I think that's really important. I guess I think I want to just reemphasize perhaps, and I think this is true in Vermont, what I've heard here is getting young people involved from the start is really, really important. And I know we have a number of teachers like Judy who are doing this work in schools right now. Thanks.
Thanks so much for you both. So I've heard a couple of things about from Judy, the long work that goes into the relationships. It's not just something that starts with a single legislative session. It's actually built over time, and that the apology itself is not the end. It's a means to an end to generating and proliferating these conversations. So that's really helpful advice. And thanks to you both for the fantastic presentations across these sessions, but also what a model you've left for many of us in the region. Perhaps now we can turn to Professor Burke. I can ask you, you had this wonderful formulation to have us think about a different center in which our logics, our whole orientation changes. It seems like it's not just a policy that can be added within a framework. And I find that that's so compelling. And I want to invite you to say, more about opportunities for people to kind of think about how that's applied, how it's put into practice, how we disrupt the dominant center and open up the possibilities of a new center. So could I invite you to speak to that question?
Sure, thank you so much for asking. That's a great question. I'm thinking about right now, we're living through a time with a lot of change. When we have these shifts, it's sort of an opportunity that we can take advantage of. And so part of what I'm thinking about is how we can frame that different center and see various perspectives as we're going through something and that's causing society to change in the way that it is. And I would also like to add that some of the challenges for the signing deaf community is that our language itself, we can have discussions amongst ourselves, with each other, but a challenge is crossing boundaries sometimes, where people who only know spoken language and people who only know signed language, there's a lack of accessibility sometimes in the structures here. And so if we have an economy that pays for interpreters to enable communication amongst these communities, it relies on having funding for those types of things. So there are resources that need to be allocated in order for society to be structured in a way that gives deaf people the ability and the resources to communicate what we discuss amongst ourselves. And so it's not only for individuals, but also for businesses and institutions where we don't necessarily have the resources that allows for empowerment. And so we have to depend on asking colleagues, for example, or asking for spaces, or asking for permission to spaces that are sometimes blocked from us, if that's clear.
Yes. Thanks. What I so appreciate about that is you're giving us a way that a very tangible set of practices around interpretation and expanding access and interchange actually has built into it a different center in some ways. It's not only about the practices, it's about decentering a certain way that about communication. Thank you. And thank you for your wonderful contribution. I think we'll go to Anne, Neil, and then Milton to close it. And Anne, we have a question that's really about how eugenics has long been connected with a certain kind of a vision about elite ruling authority and the authority of the wealthy over workers and wage and non-workers. And so a lot of your work is also about reproductive justice, which is an alternative vision to that. So this might be a chance for you to speak to some of that work as a kind of counter to kind of elimination theories. What is a proactive vision around that? And what connections do you see in relationship to wealth and the concentration of wealth?
That is one question. I cannot hope to answer that. Let's see. There's many parts to that. I guess what I will seize on is that reproductive justice framework does provide an alternative approach, and it really routes out eugenic thinking in many ways. And of course, reproductive justice is the work of Black women in the US who came up with the framework in the 90s. And it's the three main tenets are that people have the right to have children, they have the right not to have children, and they have the right to parent children in sustainable community and healthy community. And so I think all of those tenets really support an alternative vision for who can have children and for supporting one another more broadly. As to the questions of wealth and inequality, I think that those are massive and cannot be answered in a couple of minutes. But I can answer, there is a question in the Q&A box that's related, I think, talking about how eugenics really targets people who in poverty. And I think that in this country, we need to keep an eye on the targeting of long-acting reversible contraception, which is seen as a poverty alleviation tool. So really continuing to target Black and brown young women for poverty reduction. So it's alive and well, and is really a troubling trend. So.
Thanks, Anne, for that. And again, all the coercive policies, right, that coerce, especially that associate wealth and class with the ability and discretion to have or not have children. So really appreciate that. And of course, all your work. Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left. Neil, I'm going to turn to you. So, a lot of your work is oriented towards the, what people might call the bench science, the pure science, so-called of it. And a lot of what we've heard here is that there's, in many ways, no such thing as science unmediated by ideology, by social relations, by power. So what is your kind of concluding, advice, thoughts, reflections about how scholars and researchers who identify more in those fields might begin to orient themselves towards the rich and complex insights that we've heard today? Like what can we do with this, for those colleagues?
Thank you. So I think we have to hold major institutions' feet to the fire. So that would be the National Academies of Sciences, Medicine and Engineering, National Academy of Medicine. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, in 2015, they promoted societal consensus in using germline genome editing. And they've moved away from that to, well, some people have used it now, so it's out there, so how do we kind of embrace it and start to think about it, as opposed to bringing together everyone, as I said, to talk about this and not just say, well, it's already, the genie's out of the bottle, so let's go forward. Ben Hurlbut at Arizona State University writes brilliantly about this and says that science often leads the conversation. So I would implore academics to help lead the conversation, and that includes those in the humanities and social sciences particularly, to have this conversation with those who are members, let's say, of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, because we're just going to keep moving forward as researchers use CRISPR more and more. It is a profound tool. we can alleviate suffering, for instance, with sickle cell disease, but it also has the potential to do many other things in the wrong hands. And we have so many different topics to cover in terms of social, or actually what kind of legal control should we have over all of these tools. And so we need academics to speak up, as you're just asking, and we really need to address our leading institutions and say, hey, what are you promoting here?
Great. Thank you, Neil, for that. And that gives us a real charge to think about both an audience and what the message is. Milton, we're right at time. I just thought we might just turn to you. You've told us we have to continue to think about collaboration, different audiences, different connections. How can we, what are the resources and platforms and networks and forums that we can draw on to stay together, maybe starting with from small beginnings? What are your closing comments on how we keep connected?
I'll throw out two models that are likely to emerge out of this region. I can probably speak most directly to it. So one is following up on the recent allocation of funds that came about with the passage of AB 1007, which is a reparation bill in California for survivors of California sterilization. One of the opportunities is to engage students and community members, scholars, and activists around interrogating and marking the sites of transgression, which are the state hospitals, most of which are unmarked. And so these transgressive spaces are hidden in plain sight. And so part of the effort would be to call the community together to mark these sites, and most importantly, to have the conversations about what does it mean that these things are hidden in plain sight. The other thing I'll sort of thought really quickly is I recently joined the board of California Trout, and one of the things I've been thinking about very seriously is how to create, reimagine environmental education, and what sort of envisioning are watershed coalitions where school districts, scientists, researchers, tribal communities, scholars are brought together to construct K-12 hands-on science that are immersive experiences where students are actually engaged in the environment from early on, so that they actually learn systems thinking. They learn that things don't have differential value. They have value in relationship to each other. So these projects are nascent, but both of them, I think, hold a tremendous possibility. And most importantly, they would be sustained efforts. And the sustained nature is what's important to not only regain and build trust across communities, but also to deal with the complexity of these issues that we're engaging with. So thanks for an opportunity to share those. I look forward to being connected to all of you as we move forward, because again, we're going to be smarter and more effective collectively, and I look forward to the work ahead. We've got a lot to fight for, and I'm just glad to see the community growing. So thanks for putting this together, Dan. Great session.
Yeah, I'm grateful to everyone. We're at time now, to colleagues for your brilliance, your commitment, your capacity to listen, teach, and learn. We're so grateful to the Hutchins Center for hosting all three of these sessions, bringing us together, giving us the platform to exchange. We have lots and lots of work in front of us, but it's work that at its best is exciting and generative, and puts us much more in touch with our own kind of humanity and our capacity to love and care for one another. And that's what I'm left with. Thank you, Benedict, for moving us up. Grateful. We'll say goodbye now, and really, really looking forward to all that still has to come. Goodbye, everyone.
Take care. Be well, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.